President Joe Biden speaking publicly for the first time since Donald Trump's victory, touting his administration's accomplishments while comforting a defeated base, as we're learning of growing frustration within his party and finger-pointing following Kamala Harris's loss. Plus, who will run the House? Republicans are hoping and planning for a clean sweep after taking the Senate and presidency. How Republican lawmakers are now preparing to carry out Donald Trump's agenda.
And awkward timing. The Fed is poised to cut rates as Trump's win could impact the central bank's future decisions. We're following these major developing stories and many more, all coming in right here to CNN News Central.
President Joe Biden today vowing a peaceful transfer of power as President-elect Donald Trump prepares for his return to the White House. Today, President Biden addressing the nation for the first time since Trump's sweeping victory, where he promised a very different transition from what the American people witnessed 4 years ago. Listen.
I also hope we can lay to rest the question about the integrity of the American electoral system. It is honest, it is fair, and it is transparent, and it can be trusted. Win or lose, I will do my duty as president. I'll fulfill my oath, and I will honor the Constitution. On January 20th, we'll have a peaceful transfer of power here in America.
As President Biden works to lower the temperature, we're told that many Democrats, they're seething over his decision not to leave the presidential race sooner. CNN's Kayla Tausche is joining us now from the White House. And Kayla, there are a lot of Democrats pointing fingers directly at Biden for this defeat. What are you learning?
Well, in the light of day, Brianna, emotions here at the White House are still incredibly raw, but there is a lot of soul searching and finger pointing going on as they try to figure out what happened and how they got to this point over not just the last several months, but over the last several years. CNN is now reporting that top Democrats are pointing fingers at President Biden himself. Of course, he decided to leave the race only after the urging of top party leaders following a disastrous debate performance in July, but they've suggested that if he had decided to be the transition candidate or to announce that he wasn't seeking re-election perhaps in the middle of his term, that there would have been a robust primary process that perhaps would have led to a more viable candidate than Vice President Kamala Harris. One former Biden administration official telling CNN's MJ Lee this: the lack of a competitive process for a replacement, that he didn't allow for that to happen. People are still angry about the shunning that they took for speaking out earlier about him. And I'm also told that some senior party officials are also looking at rising stars within the party. California Governor Gavin Newsom, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, suggesting that if they had decided to launch a primary bid against Biden, sure, they would have gotten blowback from the White House, from the incumbent, but it also would have led to a debate earlier on in this cycle, laying bare the limitations of Biden's age and allowing Democrats to potentially pursue an alternative plan much earlier in the cycle. Of course, this is all Monday morning quarterbacking, but preparing for the new administration. The Biden administration is now trying to figure out how they can Trump-proof as much of President Biden's legacy as possible. They're trying to disperse about $7 billion in aid to Ukraine by January 20th that would otherwise be liable to be clawed back. They're also trying to look at what spending under President Biden's semiconductor, infrastructure, and climate laws can be spent this year, even though many of those pieces of legislation are long-term. And they're also safeguarding some protections for agency employees, making it more difficult for a Trump administration to potentially fire them, though officials acknowledge it's not perfect, it's not foolproof, but it will at least buy those employees a little bit of time. Boris, Brianna?
All right, Kayla, thank you for the report from the White House. And as President-elect Trump prepares to return to power, we're told the behind-the-scenes maneuvering to be part of his new administration is heating up. Perhaps no surprise. CNN's Kristen Holmes is in West Palm Beach for us, just outside of Mar-a-Lago. Kristen, what's the latest there?
Well, we know Donald Trump met with his transition team yesterday. He's meeting with them again today, but that behind-the-scenes jockeying is in full effect. I mean, the wheels are really in motion here, and Donald Trump is listening to quite a few people who are calling him, giving him ideas for various positions. But also we have to remember that this transition had already been sitting down, the heads of the transition, with various candidates, vetting them. They were working up proposals to also give Donald Trump. So there's a lot of incoming information. Now, the one thing to point out here is two critical jobs that are likely to be two of the first filled jobs. The first being chief of staff. This will be the president's right hand. It will be the person who really is the next in line. I know J.D. Vance is the vice president, but in terms of power within the White House and having the president's ear, this is the person who is likely to do that. Now, we are told that Susie Wiles is the front runner for that job. She ran his campaign. She was with him even when most Republicans had distanced themselves from him after he left office in disgrace back in 2021. But there are a number of other names on the list other than just Susie. However, we are told that it's Susie's to turn down at this point. Obviously, anything can happen. It's Donald Trump, and we know a lot of people are in his ear. Now, the other job to keep a very close eye on is Attorney General. This is important in any administration, but it is critical in a Trump administration, and here's why. We have been reporting for the last year that one of the things Donald Trump wants to do is essentially take the independence away from the Department of Justice. He believes that they should be completely one and the same with the executive branch and the White House, meaning that he'll be working hand in hand with an Attorney General to do some of the things that he wants to do, and that includes potentially retaliate against various political rivals. It's also going to be the person who's in charge of potentially firing Jack Smith and getting those cases, those federal cases against him, dismissed. He needs somebody who is loyal, who has stood by him, and there is a long list of people who are interested in that position and whose names are being floated, just to give you a few. And again, this is a fluid situation. He is looking at a number of people, but here are some of them. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, Matt Whitaker, he who served as the acting AG after Jeff Sessions was fired. Mike Lee, the senator from Utah. John Ratcliffe, who is the former director of national intelligence. Two other names that we actually don't have on that graphic, but are two conservative lawyers who have gone to bat for Donald Trump time and time again, not just behind the scenes, but also on TV. Important to Donald Trump, Mike Davis and Mark Paletta. There was a heavy push for each of them. Unclear whether or not they would take it, whether or not they could get the confirmation. One thing to also keep in mind, Donald Trump is going to have power of the Senate. So a lot of these questions as to whether or not he could get people confirmed, they are no longer as much of an issue when Donald Trump goes back to Washington. And the last thing I'll say here, Donald Trump is coming back to a very different Washington than we saw the first time he entered office in 2017. His team knows what they want. They know how to do it, and they have the allies in both the Senate and the House to get the things that he wants to get done. He's already starting to write executive orders with his team, and they plan to hit the ground running in a way that we did not see in 2017.
Yeah, in 2016 to 2017, the transition was effectively thrown out by Trump because of his break with Chris Christie at the time. Kristen Holmes from West Palm Beach, thank you so much. Let's discuss with our panel. We have CNN senior political analyst Mark Preston, Democratic strategist Chuck Rocha, and Republican strategist for Axiom Strategies, Aaron Perini. Thank you all for being with us. Mark, first to you, what did you make of what we heard from President Biden this morning?
Oh, well, a couple things. One, not surprised in his measured tone at times. If you heard the inflection of his voice, and I'll talk about that in a moment, I found that very interesting because Joe Biden is somebody who not only speaks with his words, but with the tone of his voice and with his body language. I mean, for Joe Biden, it was concise, so, thank God for that. But there's so much focus on this comment that he said. He said, you can't love a country, only when you win. And there will be a lot of focus on that. Here's another line, though, that I think that is more important in the near term that I don't think people are focusing on. He said, now we have 74 days to finish our term. Our term, again, the inflection of his voice when he said our term, let's make every day count. That's the responsibilities we have to the American people. Okay, so what are the responsibilities that Joe Biden has to his own political party, the infighting we're seeing right now, and will there be pressure from the left for him to try to do anything he can do right now, push people into government before Donald Trump takes over in January? So a lot to unpack there, but there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, there is a lot. And Aaron, let's unpack a little bit of it. What do you think about that idea of Joe Biden and what he may be doing, and certainly what is going to be some whiplash as Trump comes in? What are you looking for in the transition?
There are a couple of things. One, it's going to be any level of executive action that Joe Biden takes, because there is going to be likely a Republican sweep and Republican control in both the House and the Senate, they have the opportunity to use what's called the Congressional Review Act, where they are able to put out the ability to overturn those executive actions within 60 legislative days of that action taking effect. So Joe Biden, if he's going to try to push anything through in these last few days, is going to be very limited in long term what that means for his legacy and what he is able to accomplish because of the clean Republican victory just the other day.
Chuck, well, go ahead.
I was going to say that there's a lot of money that's still in government from all these big packages that he passed, whether it was the infrastructure, whether it was building back all the things. There's a lot of just money there that if they don't get out the door before the 20th of January, which what we were just talking about, Republicans, as the reporter said, could pull some of that back, say, okay, you didn't spend it, we're going to go use it for what we want to use it for. And I think that's one of the biggest things I heard.
Yeah, one of those issues is green initiatives, and hundreds of millions of dollars that have been invested there and are just waiting to be assigned. Chuck, I wanted to ask you about the contrast in Biden's speech from what we heard before Election Day, and also in Harris's speech yesterday, because you're hearing these folks come out and say, we're going to be okay, things are going to be fine, but we can't give up the fight, etc. Contrast that with Donald Trump is a fascist, the country is in danger, what Oprah said the day before the election, saying that we may never have another election again. It's a very different tone.
People put everything into this election, whether you were a Democrat or Republican. People get very emotionally invested in these things, and it's important if you're the leader to say it's going to be okay. I have people in my family on both sides of the party who thought this was the end of the world one way or the other, and it's very important as a leader to say everything's going to be okay. It may not have ended the way you wanted it to end, but we will live to fight another day, and now we have a government to run or these other things. That's really, really important for a guy that runs elections, that wants everybody to come back and vote again in 2 years and have this conversation one more time, to be like, we lost this time. We may not lose next time. Let's get to work.
Well, let's talk, Aaron, about what Trump was saying before the election, because it was a very dark closing, as we noted. At times, you would express that you wished he would focus more on the issues. I don't know, maybe he would have done better if he had, but he didn't actually need to, it turned out, in order to have the win that he did. What does that portend, do you think, that closing message for how he's going to govern?
Well, I think two things. That closing message, it shows how disconnected a lot of us who live in this Acela corridor were. Because while we were sitting here saying, and I was one of them, Trump would be better served staying on message. I still fully believe that. The American people knew what they were getting with Donald Trump. They remember the economy. They remember the safety at the southern border. And they have that nostalgic feeling. And it is very hard to beat 3/4 of the country telling you you're on the wrong track. That number was almost impossible for Kamala Harris to overcome. So all of that put together, when you look at it in its totality, what it means is that Donald Trump has a mandate now from the American people. They said, we had this economy before. My wages were going up. They saw the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which tax legislation will be up in the 2025 calendar year. Some of those provisions will be sunsetting. So they were like, good, I want more tax cuts. That's what I want. They know what they're going to get with him, and now he's able to just go and execute on it.
Mark, there was also a considerable amount of chaos during the Trump administration, especially early on when there were these different fiefdoms. We were just talking to Kristen Holmes about the transition, how there really wasn't an efficient transition. There were all these different fiefdoms fighting each other early on in the Trump administration, a lot of early exits of folks. Now that's not in play. How do you expect this transition to go? What do you think Trump is going to try to accomplish in the very early stages of his second administration?
Oh, so a couple things. One, they've had 8 years to really fully understand government. 4 of those years, they were in the government. So, they know how to walk around the buildings, which in and of itself can be pretty confusing when you come to Washington if you've ever walked around the buildings. But listen, this is what you're going to see. I know there's a lot of talk about, whether Robert Kennedy Jr. is going to be confirmed as a cabinet secretary, whether Elon Musk is going to have to be put in a position for cabinet secretary. He doesn't have to. All you need is Donald Trump's ear. We understand that. Cabinet secretaries, look, they're very important. They help create policy. In a Donald Trump administration, they are just implementing what he says. So that's number one. Number two, when I heard this morning from a senior Trump advisor, there is a lot of resumes right now coming in from Silicon Valley, okay, from the tech bros. And there is this fascination with, from Republicans with their new connection to Silicon Valley, which used to be very Democratic, as we know, and how they may come into the administration. So you may see some stronger bonds between Silicon Valley beyond Elon Musk and the Republican Party and Donald Trump's administration.
I mean, I think we can agree on that. What Trump wants is someone who's going to implement his vision, and it's normally what a president wants, right? However, Donald Trump sometimes draws outside the lines on what he wants a lot of times. So to that point, Chuck, I wonder, as you were looking at the jobs in the cabinet and you were looking at the candidates for these jobs and who might implement what Donald Trump says, who concerns you most? What position concerns you most?
I think Mark brought up a good point. They know what they want last time. Last time they were kind of flat-footed. They didn't think they were going to win, and they were unprepared. And speaking of Donald Trump, everybody can see I'm wearing my big red Donald Trump tie today because I've talked a lot of smack on this network, and I don't want to be audited, so I'm making sure that everybody... Now, that's just me, and I'm an on-air Mexican redneck. Now, think about if you want to run something. Think about if you want to be the Secretary of the Education. Think about if you want to be the Secretary of the Army. He wants people that do just what I did, who suck up to him, make him feel good, but will implement a plan that other people around him have. I can say it's a bad plan. She can say it's a good plan. We can argue the plan, but he wants somebody that's loyal. Last time, he listened to a lot of people.
Hey, that's not fair that this was going to be an interactive segment and we weren't given any heads up. I can't say, hey, look at my tie now. I mean, it's been done. What are you going to say?
Chuck did that all on his own.
As usual.
Aaron, one of the first things we saw when Trump took power was the implementation of a plan that sort of failed and then got reincarnated a few times, and it was this ban on Muslim countries. That originated from the sort of Steve Bannon wing, the fiefdoms that I was talking about, with Bannon not necessarily being in office this time, but still having the ear of Donald Trump. How big would you say that sort of influence is from that wing of Trump support, the nativist, sort of America first?
I think you need to look at who is currently being floated as a possible White House chief of staff. It's Susie Wiles. She's a tried and true professional. And while there are other people who might have access and the ear of the president, there are few people, and we all know this, who have been in Donald Trump's orbit, who have made it as long and are as trusted as Susie Wiles. And not only is she a political professional, but the president trusts her. And I've seen reporting where she's pushed back on the president, but she knows when to let go in the fight and which fights are worth it. If you consider that as the person at the helm, or any of the other names that are being floated, like a Brooke Rollins, I've seen reporting that there could be possibly Kevin McCarthy considered. Those are people who could be, the stronger voice in the room, considering they're closest to the president, versus those who might have his ear, but are not necessarily influencing his decision making.
It would be fascinating to see Kevin McCarthy in the White House, especially given the history that they've had. McCarthy was the first Republican to visit Trump in Mar-a-Lago after January 6th.
Listen, if I'm Donald Trump, and certainly I'm not, but if I was Donald Trump, I would put Susie Wiles as the chief of staff to set up the government, because the thing about Susie Wiles is she doesn't need anything from Donald Trump. When people go to Donald Trump, they kind of want something from him. She doesn't need anything. On election night, when he tried to get her to talk, she tried to hide. So that's number one. Number two, I would put Kevin McCarthy in some kind of czar role to work with Capitol Hill, because as much as Kevin McCarthy, is a true Republican and what have you, he does know how to cut a deal. And there are deals that are going to need to be cut.
It'll be interesting to see how he might get along with a potential Republican House. Mark, Aaron, Chuck, appreciate the conversation. Thank you so much. Happening today, the Federal Reserve is expected to cut interest rates for the second time this year. And the central question is, will they keep driving rates even lower in the coming months?
As we transition to a new president, the economy is also facing a new direction. As Trump has vowed to attack inflation with tax cuts and tariffs, economists are concerned that those promises could end up reigniting inflation. CNN's Matt Egan is with us live now. All right, Matt, let's talk first about the Fed decision today. What are we expecting?
Well, Boris and Brianna, it does look like another interest rate cut from the Federal Reserve is imminent. The market is pricing in something like a 99% chance that the Fed cuts rates by 1/4 point today. Very little chance that the Fed goes big again like it did in September with that 1/2 point interest rate cut. So there's not much drama about what the Fed is going to do, but there is some drama over what Fed officials are going to say. Fed Chair Jerome Powell, he is going to face a lot of questions at this press conference about the elephant in the room, right? President-elect Trump's economic agenda and what those proposals mean for the economy, for jobs, for inflation. And I think the answer is it's a little bit too soon to tell, but I know that Fed officials are going to be starting to think about that. Now, the election made clear that Americans are very frustrated with how high prices are. But what's interesting is the Fed does not target price levels. They look at the rate of inflation, how much prices are going up and down. And they are satisfied that the rate of inflation is basically back to normal. And so that's why they've shifted their focus from fighting inflation to trying to protect the jobs market. And that does mean interest rate cuts. Now, this is good news for everyone who's borrowing, right? For people who are trying to pay off credit card debt, every interest rate cut will help. For people who are trying to finance the purchase of a car. But the last few weeks have been another reminder that the Fed has less control over mortgage rates. That's controlled by the bond market. And we just learned today that mortgage rates have continued to go higher. 6.8% is the latest average for a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. That's going in the wrong direction. That's up from about 6.1% the week after the Fed started cutting interest rates, and that is happening because the bond market is getting more optimistic about the economy, but they're also starting to price in the trillions of dollars in debt that could get added from Trump's plans to cut taxes. Boris and Brianna?
Matt, I do want to ask you about tariffs, because despite most mainstream economists making clear that those tariffs would wind up getting paid by consumers, Donald Trump has insisted that they should be installed and that they would help bring prices down, but the exact opposite is more likely, right?
That's right. Listen, inflation has helped to send Donald Trump back to the White House, and he's promised to attack inflation by really shaking things up with tariffs and deportations. But mainstream economists are concerned that the Trump economic agenda will be inflationary, perhaps very inflationary, in part because of those tariffs. Economists who've been surveyed by the University of Chicago have overwhelmingly said that consumers will pay those tariffs in the form of higher prices and mass deportations that could really deprive some industries of workers, and that could force them to lift wages and lift prices. But look, it's all going to come down to how this is implemented. And we'll be waiting to see, because listen, a lot is at stake. We know people are very frustrated with the cost of living, and the last thing they want to see is for prices to go even higher. Boris and Brianna?
All right, Matt Egan, thank you so much for the report. Ahead this hour on CNN News Central, Republicans on Capitol Hill have an ambitious agenda. We're going to take a look at what they hope to accomplish during the second Trump presidency. In the meantime, Democrats are huddling to figure out what went wrong. We'll talk to one of the lawmakers who made a strong case for why President Biden should drop out.
Plus, former Trump attorney Rudy Giuliani is in court after failing to turn over assets in his defamation case, including the very car that he was seen riding in this week. Stay with us. We'll be right back. As of this moment, we still don't know which party will control the House of Representatives, with votes in dozens of races still being tallied.
Yet Republicans have a small lead right now. They say they're confident that they will hold on to their grip of the chamber in what could become a GOP full sweep in Washington. We have CNN's Lauren Fox here with us. Lauren, tell us what lawmakers are saying and what they're expecting.
Yeah, Republicans did not want to be caught flat-footed like they were back in 2016, where everyone was really surprised that Donald Trump won. Then they went to try to repeal and replace Obamacare, and if you remember, it was a big old mess. So what they've been doing is, over the course of the last several months, Republicans on the tax writing committees, House Ways and Means, Senate Finance, they've actually been meeting in small groups trying to come up with ideas for what they would like to see in a major tax package. And that's likely to be one of the #1 issues that they pursue after January. That's because a lot of the popular provisions from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that Trump passed in 2017, they're about to expire at the end of 2025. And those are important and popular provisions like the expansion of the child tax credit and the estate tax deduction. So those are areas where Republicans are really looking to change some policy. Now, they may use a really difficult process that is convoluted, happens through the United States Senate, and they might try to put some other provisions in there. Donald Trump ran on immigration. A lot of Republicans ran on immigration. Do you try to include some of the border security provisions? Those things are all up for discussion right now. They're also eyeing potentially repealing parts of the Inflation Reduction Act that they don't like. So that, of course, was Biden's signature policy bill, climate and economic bill. So a lot of things that Republicans are talking about. I will tell you that while we have not called the House, Republicans are feeling really bullish, and, they're starting to think about what they want to do.
when do you think we might call the House? When would we get some results?
Yeah, Republicans had talked a little bit about this, but California just traditionally has taken a long time to count all the ballots, and there are a lot of really competitive districts, like John Duarte's district or Valadeo's district. So it's going to take a little bit of time to get that final call. Republicans still, though, they've been thinking not just in the last week, but over the last several months what they would do if they swept the House, the White House, and the Senate.
Lauren Fox, thanks so much for the reporting. Appreciate it. So voters in as many as 5 battleground states may have split their tickets picking Donald Trump for president, but then picking a Democrat or a different party for a different statewide office. Joining us now is Larry Sabato, director of the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia. Larry, thank you so much for being with us. Kamala Harris did worse than some of the other Democrats on the ticket, especially in Michigan and Wisconsin. There was an open seat race in Michigan that a Democrat won, and then in Wisconsin, the incumbent Democrat Tammy Baldwin was reelected. Trump carried both of those states. Why do you think that happened?
Well, it's interesting. I've looked at some of the data, and it seems to me that you had some Donald Trump only voters. That is, they went into the booth or they filled out their mail-in ballot and they just voted for Trump. They didn't vote for other offices, or they voted for Trump and they voted for the Democrat. Maybe they recognized the incumbent Democrat's name. But very clearly, Democrats did better by a couple of points, which was all you really needed to keep some key seats, which gets them to the level where they can actually have an influence in the Senate rather than being steamrolled.
Yeah, and it didn't make the difference in some places for sure, but it is really interesting to look at these ticket splitting places. Before Tuesday, you know, it seemed, Larry, a lot of analysts were saying it used to be that all politics were local, and now it's that all politics are national. Is it both now?
Well, most politics now is national because we are so partisan and we are so polarized. But that doesn't mean a candidate can't somehow get a couple of percent from the independent category not available to his or her presidential candidate. And that often makes the difference, as it did in these cases that we're citing here. And we could cite many cases, actually, from that election night where somebody would get elected down the ballot by a healthy margin, whereas the presidential candidate was losing by an unhealthy margin. That happens. It just doesn't happen as commonly as it once did, where on an election night, you would often have, half the Senate being elected of the other party from the party of the presidential winner in that state. I think those days, if not gone forever, they're gone for a long time.
There was some ticket splitting on certain ballot measures, and 7 of 10 ballot measures protecting abortion rights passed, including in Arizona, Nevada, and Missouri, where Trump either won or is currently ahead. I wonder what you make of Democrats having invested so much messaging on reproductive rights and it not having appeared to become a main driver for voters, even though we saw these ballot measures pass.
Well, Trump made a decision, maybe off the cuff, or maybe it was something that was planned, that diffused part of the abortion question, part of the overturning of Roe v. Wade liability for him, in which he made it pretty clear in the language that he was using that he wouldn't support a national abortion ban, and we'll see whether that's true, and that he still had a part of himself, really, like the time he said on national television at the turn of the century, I am 100% pro-choice on abortion. Well, that obviously changed while he was president. So he eased the way for those voters to say, well, I like him better for president, and I don't really believe he's going to ban abortion generally. Look at the percentage in some of these states of Republicans who voted for the protections on abortion for their state constitution, and at the very same time voted for Trump. Now, it may seem irrational or contradictory, but to them it made perfect sense, and they're the voters.
Larry, what are you expecting in the House, and how much will it matter?
I think there's very little chance that Democrats will control the House. There's some small chance But I think Republicans are going to have everything. It would matter a lot to Democrats if they could veto in at least one place. In most cases in the Senate, they won't be able to, although Republicans don't have 60 reliable votes. And they obviously don't have the White House, and they won't have the cabinet officials and much of the bureaucracy, the senior level of civil servants. But you know what? We often look at the bad side of these things. If you're a Democrat, you look at the bad side and say it's terrible that Republicans have control of all this, but it gives you a big advantage. Since the Republicans are in charge of absolutely everything, they are also responsible for absolutely everything that happens in their 2-year or 4-year or 6-year term. So Democrats can run with that. They can hold them accountable the way the Republicans held Democrats accountable for, say, inflation.
Yeah, we all remember the backlash of 2010 after Democrats controlled everything. It can be swift and it can be big. Larry Sabato, thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you.
So what do Democrats do now? After losing the White House, the Senate, and very possibly failing to retake the House, the party is facing its own moment of truth and reckoning. We'll talk to Congressman Seth Moulton about what Democrats need to do after Trump's decisive win. And before we go to break, take a listen to some of the reaction that we're hearing from voters about Trump's win.
I'm personally okay with the results of the election.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of tension surrounding the situation. I think ultimately I am putting my faith in something higher, and so I'm just kind of trying to separate myself from the divisiveness and all of that that's happening because of this.
The blame game is in full swing within the Democratic Party. New CNN reporting reveals that the boiling frustration among members of that party over Trump's decisive election victory, and some of that frustration is squarely aimed at President Biden for his decision to seek a second term. A senior Harris campaign official tells CNN, quote, the lack of a competitive process for a replacement, that he didn't allow for that to happen. People are still angry about the shunning that they took for speaking out earlier about him. One of the first Democratic lawmakers to call for Biden to step aside was Congressman Seth Moulton of Massachusetts, and he is with us now. Congressman, just to remind people, as pressure was mounting on Biden after that debate performance to drop out in July, you were very public. You wrote an op-ed in the Boston Globe. I mean, a lot of people were speaking out, but they were doing it privately. And you said that at the D-Day anniversary in France the month before, Biden, who you had long known and interacted with, and he'd been, a mentor for you in politics, that he didn't seem to recognize you. So I wonder, as you're reflecting today, who bears the blame here? Is it him? Is it the people around him who may have seen those signs long before, say, you, or are others to blame? What do you think?
Well, look, there's a lot of blame to go around. And to be clear, I spoke out loudly and publicly only after I had spoke out in private and really tried to convince the administration quietly that he should step aside. But look, I'm not going to exonerate myself here. Sitting here this afternoon, do I wish I had spoken up even earlier, even though I was one of the first Democratic lawmakers to speak up publicly? Sure. Yeah, I wish I'd done so even earlier.
So you, and I don't mean to put you on too much of a pedestal here, but you have challenged stalwarts in your party about whether they represent your party effectively. You repeatedly opposed Nancy Pelosi being speaker, for instance. You ultimately, though, did come around, and I wonder if you regret that, and if you see anyone having influence in your party if they don't get in line. Is there room for someone to really ring that bell effectively?
Well, I mean, Nancy Pelosi was a remarkable leader, the first woman to become speaker, but I thought it was time for a new generation of leadership, and I only agreed to support her after she agreed to step down, a deal that she honored. I feel like a lot of people believe that Joe Biden was elected anticipating that he would do one term and then be a bridge to the new generation, just as he said himself, and yet he didn't really honor that. Now, maybe it wasn't a firm promise, but I think our party would have been much better off if he had stepped aside. There's a time and a place for everyone. And when I do town halls back in my district, I often say to the high school kids who show up, if I'm still in office when you're old enough to run, you should consider running against me. And if we have a fair contest and I'm still doing this and I'm doing it well and I win, that's one thing. But leaders should be challenged. That makes a party stronger. It helps move us forward. And I think that even if Kamala Harris had been our nominee, but she had gotten there through a competitive primary process, she would have been a much stronger candidate for president.
You have Senator Sanders blaming party leaders for abandoning working class voters. You also have Congressman Richie Torres blaming the far left for alienating them. So I wonder what you think is the right message for the party going forward. Who's right here?
Actually, I think both Bernie and Richie are right. I think we do need to reconnect with working class voters. We haven't done enough for them. We haven't spoken to their concerns. And by definition, we're out of touch because they clearly don't support us at the polls. I think Richie is also right to a certain degree. I'm grateful for the advocacy and the ideas that the far left brings to our party, but we can't be branded by that. We can't be defined by the far left. We're a much broader party than that. And if we're going to win more elections, we've got to appeal to voters in the center, these independents who so often decide these tough contests, and in this case clearly swung towards Donald Trump.
We just spoke to Larry Sabato, and he said something that there are a lot of political observers saying, which is that it is very possible, very likely, as he thought, that Democrats will not be able to retake the House, and that then you have a situation where President-elect Trump is in control of all levers in Washington. What is your biggest concern about that?
My biggest concern is for the fate of our country when it comes to national security, and for the fate of our democracy when it just comes to preserving the norms and values that have been so important to our country for almost 250 years. So what does that mean? It means that we've got to be very careful about what this next commander-in-chief does. Never before in American history has a president been told by or publicly told by so many senior advisors and his most senior military officials that he's unfit to be commander-in-chief. We had from his chief of staff, Marine General John Kelly, and we've heard it from many others. But we also know that on January 5th, even the morning of January 6th, that I was sitting in my office in the Capitol complex up at Washington, D.C., I never imagined that a sitting president would incite a riot to try to overturn a peaceful democratic election. So we have to anticipate the worst, both domestically and internationally. He could well get us involved in wars overseas with his bluster and the way that he appeals to our adversaries more than our allies. And he could also significantly erode our democracy here at home in ways that could last for generations.
So with your big concern, one of your big concerns being national security, I wonder how you're reflecting on perhaps the most important decision that was made when it comes to national security of the Biden administration. You sort of infamously, with one of your then colleagues, a Republican, flew into the Kabul airport during the botched evacuation of Afghanistan. And that was really a turning point in how Americans, I mean, if you look at the polls, if you look at how Biden was viewed, that was really a turning point, and he had a difficulty recovering his footing after that. Do you see that now as a turning point for his presidency and for how Americans viewed him and viewed Democrats and their capacity to lead?
I mean, it clearly was. You can look at the past polling, and he never recovered from the reputational hit he took when he made that decision. And I mean, I think it's funny that you refer to our trip there, the bipartisan trip I did with my colleague from Michigan, as infamous. That's a Biden administration talking point. After I showed up in Kabul to try to understand what was going on and help us make better decisions sitting on the Armed Services Committee and other committees in Congress, because we had no idea what was actually happening on the ground. We didn't know, for example, if we should push to extend the deadline and keep Americans on the ground longer. Brianna, I couldn't walk into a bar anywhere in America and not have people come up to me from both parties and thank me for what we did. So actually, this is a great example of how the Biden administration, this Democratic administration, was really out of touch with America, pulling us out of Afghanistan way that cost American lives and ultimately really impacted our foreign policy was a mistake. And we should be able to admit that. And we as Democrats should be willing to fix it. That's what I was willing to do.
Yeah, I didn't actually mean for there to be a pejorative use of that adjective. It was just this moment that stood out as kind of I guess it was sort of an unbelievable, might be a better adjective, something that happened during that time. It was really something to see you and Peter Meijer show up there. Hardly could believe that it happened, in fact. Congressman Seth Moulton, thank you so much for your time.
Great to see you, Brianna.
So a big question in Washington and across the country today, what is the fate of federal workers if Trump looks to put his stamp on the government? We're going to look at what the president-elect has sworn to do. We'll have that next.
Former Trump attorney Rudy Giuliani just left court after facing questions over whether he's complied with an order to turn over assets to a pair of Georgia election workers who he defamed after the 2020 election.
The workers who Giuliani owes nearly $150 million say they have yet to receive some of the most valuable items that they're owed, like the very car, this one, that he was seen riding in just 2 days ago. CNN's Caitlin Polantz is live outside of the courthouse in Manhattan. Caitlin, tell us what happened.
Yeah, the wrangling over this order where Giuliani defamed these women and has to give up many of his most valuable possessions. They're still wrangling over it because Giuliani's team says he just isn't getting enough direction to figure out how to give these items over. And so after a lengthy court hearing today, where at one point the judge told Giuliani explicitly, if you don't turn your items over, you will be held in contempt. You could face sanctions from the court. He got a deadline. That deadline to provide his luxury items, watches, his grandfather's watch, sports memorabilia like a Joe DiMaggio signed jersey, and some other items, the keys to that Mercedes-Benz, all of that he has to provide to the lawyers of Ruby Freeman and Shaye Moss by next week. And Giuliani, he is walking there. He's exiting. He's speaking to the cameras right now behind me at the federal courthouse in Manhattan, a courthouse where he once was presiding on the opening as the mayor, today grumbling in court and being told by the judge at one point he was being ridiculous. Brianna and Boris.
All right. And Caitlin, what do you see going on behind you there? So it's kind of difficult to see. I know there's a car in the way, but there's obviously a scrum of reporters who are watching him.
Yeah, these reporters are watching Giuliani because he hasn't been present physically for these hearings, but he was told by the judge he had to be here today in court. And through this hearing, as his lawyer tried to walk back things he has done so far, the judge kept saying, talk to your client. He's right there. Ask Giuliani. And Giuliani kept whispering things like other people were being tortured around him, that they were being vindictive. And so in this situation, his lawyer was getting answers there, as was the judge. And now Giuliani speaking as he's leaving court.
Caitlin, is that him yelling?
No, I don't believe so.
No,
I think that's someone else on the streets of Manhattan.
I just want to be sure. Caitlin Polantz.
Wish that van would move. Okay, Caitlin Polantz, thank you so much for the report. The peaceful transition of power is underway in Washington, but once Donald Trump is inaugurated, some policy experts warn parts of Project 2025 may soon start to reveal themselves.
Specifically, that the new administration may politicize the federal workforce by replacing experienced workers with Trump and party loyalists. CNN senior White House producer Betsy Klein joins us now. Betsy, what exactly is Trump promising to do?
Well, Boris, just to put this in perspective, there are 4,000 political appointees in the federal government who will likely depart at the end of the Biden administration. But there are over 2 million career federal workers serving across the country in nonpartisan jobs, from the Postal Service to Customs and Border Protection. And we got a preview of how then President Trump wanted to handle this at the end of his first term, as he signed an executive order known as Schedule F in the days before the 2020 election. Now, that gave him more leeway in hiring and firing federal employees deemed to be disloyal. And Trump repeatedly promised on the campaign trail he would reinstate this executive order if he's reelected, vowing to demolish the deep state. And Trump has promised to reclassify thousands of civil service jobs into politically appointed positions that can be fired at will. He could move as many as 100,000 positions out of Washington and eliminate or dismantle entire departments, Boris and Brianna.
So, Betsy, do we know what the litmus test would be? How would the Trump administration determine if a federal employee is a Trump loyalist?
Well, it's a great question, and it's really unclear what kind of rubric would be used to determine so-called loyalty. But there are records for those who have donated to political campaigns or groups in the past. And there's also the question of what's publicly accessible on social media, if those workers have expressed support for another candidate or attended political rallies. So certainly a lot of anxiety about that within the federal workforce right now.
When it comes to the Biden administration, before they leave, is there anything they can do to try to prevent that, to try to protect those workers?
Well, the Biden administration had actually anticipated this and passed a rule earlier this year in April that helps safeguard federal employees for political firings. And while Trump certainly could roll that back, it would take some time through the lengthy federal rulemaking process. And our sources in the Biden administration are saying there's really not much more they could do to bolster those protections at this stage. But this could, at the very least, buy those workers some time to find a new job. So certainly a lot of questions for the federal workforce about how Trump will enforce this.
Betsy Klein, thanks so much for bringing us that report. A decision by the Fed on rate cuts is just a few minutes away. Stay with CNN News Central. We'll be right back.
A key decision from the Federal Reserve. What a rate cut could mean for your wallet and President-elect Trump's policy plans, what they mean for the central bank's future plans. Plus, Democrat blame game. President Biden addressing the nation following Donald Trump's election victory. What Biden is saying as Democrats search for answers after their resounding loss.
And transitioning to Trump, the president-elect preparing for his move back into the White House. We have new reporting on who may be going with him and what they're planning for day one. These major developing stories and many more coming your way right now on CNN News Central.
We do begin this hour with breaking news. The Fed just making its latest decision on rate cuts.
Let's get straight to CNN business anchor and correspondent Julia Chatterley. Julia, break it down for us. What's the decision?
There's good news for borrowers. The Federal Reserve delivering a 1/4 percentage point rate cut. It was a unanimous decision, and of course it adds to the 1/2 percentage point rate cut that they did back in September. In many respects, that's the easy part of today. The harder part comes next, and that's the press conference that we've got in around 30 minutes' time. And it's a case of the do's and the don'ts for Jay Powell and the Federal Reserve. What they do want to be talking about today is the fact that they've managed to engineer what we call a soft landing. They've hiked rates, they've avoided recession, at least for now, and they're very close to their inflation target. What they don't want to be talking about, quite frankly, is Donald Trump. Good luck with that. So where that leaves us basically is a situation where we know what's clear now is that while they can cut rates today, the future path of interest rates now is more uncertain. And what that depends on is the policy decisions of the president-elect, his government, of course, and who wins the House. Very important point to that, too. At worst, let's take the worst case. If he enacts mass immigration limits, mass global tariffs, it could slow growth. It could also raise inflation. Economists generally agree we could see 1 percentage point rise in inflation next year. That's going to slow the Federal Reserve down in their ability to cut rates. But of course, all we're doing is guessing at this stage, and that's the challenge for Jay Powell today. But I will say we are already seeing an impact for consumers, guys. I'm really closely following longer-term government borrowing costs, because these are very much tied to what we're seeing for mortgage rates in the United States. If you take a look at the 30-year mortgage rate chart, we're seeing mortgage rates rise right now. Now, some part of this is normal when the Federal Reserve cuts rates. You see these borrowing costs rise, but it can also be tied to the prospect of more spending. It can also be tied to the prospect of more inflation. So that's something I think that Jay Powell will also address today, even as he does his best to avoid talking politics, avoid talking about Donald Trump, and avoid talking about the things that he doesn't know yet. We have to wait to see what the government do.
Julia Chatterley, thank you so much for the update. Let's discuss now with a pair of analysts. We have Mark Zandi, chief economist for Moody's, and Doug Holtz-Eakin, former chief economist on the White House Council of Economic Advisors under President George W. Bush. He's now the president of the American Action Forum. Thank you both for being with us. Mark, first to you, your reaction to this rate cut. How exactly is this going to impact Americans?
Well, much anticipated, Boris. The Federal Reserve has achieved its goals of full employment. The unemployment rate's around 4%. It's low for all demographic groups and across the country. So check, they've achieved that goal. And they now have achieved the goal of getting inflation back down to their target, which is a 2% inflation rate, and they've done that. So they're now lowering interest rates to something that's more consistent with rates neither supporting or restraining economic growth, the so-called equilibrium rate, and they're on their way. They've got a ways to go, but they're well on their way, and that's all good news. And that's good news for American households and consumers, particularly folks that took on credit card debt or consumer finance loans or home equity lines of credit back when inflation was high to supplement their income to maintain their purchasing power. So this is good news. It should be helpful. It's going to take some time before this all translates through into lower credit card interest rates and consumer finance rates. But I think that'll occur over the next few weeks, a few months.
And Doug, what do you think?
Oh, I think Mark characterized it exactly correctly. The Fed is moving towards something that's more neutral. It's been leaning against growth in the economy, trying to slow the pace at which we get inflation. It's been largely successful in doing that. And so it is now moving back toward neutral. Given what we know, I think that it's exactly in the right place. The main part of the economic landscape, however, are the unknowns. What will the incoming Trump administration do with tariffs, with taxes, with spending, and what will happen in the global economy? So they're constantly rebalancing as they find out more about the conditions in which they're operating.
To that point, Doug, we have heard from mainstream economists this concern over the potential for tariffs installed by the Trump administration to be inflationary, and yet the stock market seemed to react positively to Trump's election. What's going on there?
Well, I try hard not to try to explain the stock market. The stock market has two components. One, the earnings of those firms that are listed on the stock market, and if their future earnings look better, stocks go up. And two, the path of interest rates and other competitive vehicles for your savings. You can put it in the stock market, you can put it in the bond market. So as people make different judgments about future interest rates and future earnings, you see the stock market move around. It can move a lot in a single day, and then they can reconsider it and it might pull back some. So it's best to look at the stock market over a sustained period. I think if we get to June of 2025 and you still see it rising at those kinds of rates, that'd be an enormous success, but I don't expect anything that large.
And Mark,
hey,
Trump...
Boris, can I take a crack at that question? Is that okay? Please. Yeah, in the stock market, I mean, in my view, it's because President Trump has promised corporate tax cuts. So, if you lower the corporate tax rate, that means the earnings, the after-tax earnings of businesses is higher, and that goes right to higher stock prices. And he's also talked about less regulation in a lot of different industries, financial services, fossil fuel, the telecom and IT industry. So less regulation means more profits, means higher stock prices. And he's probably also going to take a less kind of a jaundiced view of mergers and acquisitions. The Biden administration has been pretty tough on M&A in an effort to improve competitive pressures in industries to get prices down. But I think the Trump administration would be less likely to do that. So that's all positive for the stock market. And that's why stock prices, I think, are up to the degree that they are.
Yeah, and Doug, what do you think about his tariff plan? What are your concerns there? What do you think he's actually going to proceed with and what he may not proceed with, considering he's proposed adding between 10 and 20% tariffs on every import coming into the U.S. with up to 60% tariffs on goods from China?
Well, I certainly think his track record shows he'll do the specific tariffs on China and probably some other countries and goods. The wild card is the across-the-board 10 to 20% tariff. I have no secret insight as to the firmness of that commitment, the pace at which it will happen, but that is certainly the hardest, for example, on the Federal Reserve. Right now we have the tax code in place, and there's going to be a big debate next year about extending it to some extent or modifying it a little bit, but that's current conditions, and the Fed's baked that into their calculations. Now they have to consider the thought of a 10 to 20% tariff. What do they do? You can make the argument that you put the tariff in, it pushes up the costs, it pushes up prices. But the tariff only goes in once and they only go up once, so the Fed should just look the other way and go back to its business of controlling the long-term inflation rate. I think Mark and I would understand that, but I'm not sure the public that's very weary of inflation and very upset about high prices is going to think looking the other way is a sensible strategy. So do they then try to control it somewhat? Well, then their only option is to push interest rates back up and lean against what has been a very successful effort at a soft landing. So it's a real predicament for them to, A, figure out what will he do, and B, how will they respond?
Doug and Mark, great insights. Thank you so much to both of you. You gave us a lot to think about and to maybe worry about in some cases too. Thanks, guys.
Take care.
So today, President Biden speaking publicly for the first time since President-elect Trump's historic victory, hoping to turn down the political temperature across the country. He pledged to work with the Trump administration transition and promised a peaceful and orderly transition of power.
Meantime, we're learning new details about how Democrats are increasingly pointing fingers at President Biden for not exiting the race sooner. CNN's MJ Lee is live for us from the White House. MJ, let's start with Biden's remarks from the Rose Garden. Walk us through what he said.
Yeah, you know, Boris and Brianna, there is a line that the president over the last few years has frequently used when talking about Donald Trump, and that line is, you can't love your country only when you win. And that was always in reference to Donald Trump's refusal to accept his defeat in 2020, his questioning of the integrity of the American election system. But today, when the president said this line in the Rose Garden, the audience was not Donald Trump. It was actually the millions of Americans that he understands is feeling very disappointed and is feeling frustrated by the idea of Donald Trump coming back to the White House for another 4 years. The president said, "You're hurting. I hear you and I see you." But what he insisted was that even though all of those feelings may be valid, the results of the election are what they are, and people around the country, even if they are disappointed, must accept those results. This is what he said.
I've said many times, you can't love your country only when you win. You can't love your neighbor only when you agree. Something I hope we can do, no matter who you voted for, is see each other not as adversaries, but as fellow Americans. Bring down the temperature.
And among the president's most loyal supporters, there's a lot of sensitivity right now on how much blame is being placed on the president. A lot of folks that I've spoken to essentially saying we wouldn't find ourselves in this position had the president decided not to seek a second term and sort of stuck to that initial promise of being a bridge and a transition president. The idea being that had the Democratic Party had been able to go through the process of nominating someone under the sort of protocols that are typically used in our political system, having the full runway, basically, perhaps it would have been Kamala Harris that was nominated, perhaps not, but that we wouldn't have seen this unusual truncated Kamala Harris campaign that resulted in her loss. But there's also just a lot of anger that is being directed at President Biden himself and also some of those advisors close to him for their refusal over the recent years to tolerate any kind of criticism about his health and certainly any suggestions that the president should step aside. This is what one senior Harris campaign official told me. They said the lack of a competitive process for a replacement, that he didn't allow for that to happen. People are still angry about the shunning that they took for speaking out earlier about him. So Boris and Brianna, Democrats are clearly starting down the process of this soul searching after the events of this week. And the president's role in all of this is clearly going to be a very big part of that.
Yeah, certainly is. MJ Lee, live for us from the White House. Thank you. Let's talk now with CNN presidential historian Tim Naftali. Tim, this speech of Biden's, I mean, just because of the historic nature of these circumstances, it's a historic speech. What were your takeaways from it?
Well, he really had, President Biden really had two audiences. In part, this was a pep talk. This is a pep talk to members of the administration, apparently who were sitting right in front of him, and to Democrats across the country. But this was also a way for the president to ensure stability, to make clear to every American that their vote not only counted, but it counted for him. and that he would assure the country, and did assure the country, of a peaceful transition. He didn't have to say, unlike in 2020, 2021, but the point was he wanted to make clear that that he is not seeking revenge. So it was a very successful speech directed at two audiences. But he said one thing that I think had a double meaning. And he said, setbacks are unavoidable. Giving up is unforgivable. To many Democrats, that might be a reminder of his decision to wait late in the election cycle, not to run again. It's very Biden. It's the essence of Joe Biden, someone who has had many setbacks over the course of his political career, but has always gotten up. And what many Democrats, of course, are debating now is whether he should have decided, if you will, to give up the opportunity of a second term just after the midterms. I'm going to say one thing about that. Soul searching doesn't imply simply finding one fault. Historically, to just blame an election on a previous incumbent doesn't allow you to rethink the reason why in 2024, Vice President Harris could not keep the Biden coalition. As we see, as we work through the numbers, what we're seeing is that she wasn't able to get the same number of votes that and percentage that Biden had in many counties. I don't have the answer, but the answer isn't simply that Biden stayed too long. We don't know if inflation would have made it possible for Biden, if he'd been healthy and vigorous, to win. We also don't know whom the Democrats would have chosen if Biden had decided to be that bridge to the next generation in 2023 rather than 2024. So there are a lot of unknowns. It's very interesting for me as a historian to see that people are just trying to find one causal explanation for the dramatic reemergence of Donald Trump as a national leader, the greatest comeback, perhaps the greatest comeback ever, certainly the greatest political comeback since Richard Nixon last 2 nights ago.
Yeah, there may be multiple reasons, and they don't necessarily exclude each other from being legitimate. Tim, I wonder, and obviously Biden is still in office, and there are still many parts of his efforts legislatively that Americans are just starting to see the effects of, namely investments in infrastructure and in clean energy, et cetera, et cetera. If those make it through the early stages of the Trump administration, I'm wondering what you think how you think history will look back at Joe Biden's legacy.
Well, Boris, I can't speak on behalf of my future colleagues, but
sure,
sure.
And I just mean in the context of what we saw on Tuesday. In the context of what we saw Tuesday.
I'm not. When I listened to Joe Biden today, and I'm not sure he'd be happy to hear this, when he was talking about the infrastructure bill and the fact that its benefits to all Americans won't really be felt for perhaps 10 years. It made me think of the rethinking of Jimmy Carter's time in office. Jimmy Carter set in motion the deregulation that liberated our economy. Much of the credit for that goes to his successor, Ronald Reagan, but in fact, it's Jimmy Carter who began that process of deregulating the airlines and other transportation systems, all of which helped the U.S. economy in the 1980s. He doesn't get credit for it, although now historians and others are beginning to relook at his time in office. That didn't help Jimmy Carter become a second-term president, just as the infrastructure bill clearly didn't help the Biden-Harris team come and have a second term. But historically, presidents, while they have to worry about 4-year cycles, are also, the really good ones, are also investing in our future. And it takes a while for that future to be realized, and therefore it takes a while for people to look back and say, hey, maybe I sold that particular president short.
Tim Naftali, always great to get your perspective. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Boris. Pleasure.
When we come back, supporters of Donald Trump are now jockeying for positions in the new White House. We're going to talk about who could join his administration, plus what Trump's second term could mean for the planet's future as new data shows the devastating impact of delayed action on climate change.
And how Democrats can win back support from Latino men, and can they, after Trump's historic gains with that voting bloc. And throughout the hour, we're bringing you voters' reactions to Trump's victory. Here's what one man told CNN's Nick Valencia.
I'm happy. I hope my portfolio goes back up 40%, gas goes down by half, and we start making a lot of money again.
Right now, the big question, who will President-elect Donald Trump appoint to top positions in his new administration?
Sources tell CNN that Trump allies are quickly jockeying for positions on the heels of his decisive victory. Let's take you live to West Palm Beach with CNN's Kristen Holmes, just outside of Mar-a-Lago. Kristen, what are you hearing?
Well, Boris and Brianna, I just got off the phone with one advisor to Donald Trump. He's not with the campaign, but it's somebody who has spoken to him on a number of occasions, and said that Donald Trump is really taking this responsibility of filling an administration and a cabinet much more seriously than he ever did before. That he has privately acknowledged that he thinks he made mistakes when it came to his first term, and that he wants to make sure he fills those positions with people who are competent and also very loyal to him. We know that loyalty is probably the #1 issue for Donald Trump. So just to talk about a few of the positions that he's currently looking at, one, of course, is going to be Chief of Staff. This is a critical position in the White House. It's going to be his right hand and somebody that he needs to be able to rely on under any circumstances. And we are told that the front runner in that position currently at this very moment is Susie Wiles, who ran his campaign, who was by his side after he left Washington in disgrace in 2021, after most Republicans were trying to distance themselves from the former president after January 6th and hoping, some of them, that he would not be coming back into power. Susie remained by his side. She ran his campaign, and she ran it likely better than anyone we've ever seen run a campaign for the former president, getting him back into office, but also trying to control his worst instincts, which we know is very hard to do, and she was obviously not always successful at that. Now, the other position I want to talk about here is Attorney General. This is going to be critical in a Trump administration, as it is in any, but even more so because Donald Trump wants to make sure that he and the White House have complete control over the Department of Justice. He's going to need somebody who is loyal to him in that sense. So here's a list of people we're talking about right now. Again, this is still shifting. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, Matt Whitaker. He served as acting AG under Donald Trump when he fired Jeff Sessions. Utah Senator Mike Lee is in consideration. John Ratcliffe, who served as the former director of national intelligence. Another person that we have not mentioned, who's not on this list, is Mark Paoletta, who is someone who's actually running the policy side of the Justice Department of Transition, just within the transition here, and somebody who a lot of people would like to see inside of a White House. So these are just the beginning, but we are told that Donald Trump might make some of these decisions within the cabinet in the next week. So we'll have our eyes open, and we were talking to as many people as we can to hear who's up and who's down.
Kristen Holmes from West Palm Beach, thank you so much for the update. A huge part of Donald Trump's win can be attributed to the Latino community, particularly Latino men. Exit polls show that 55% in this demographic favored Trump. That's up nearly 20 points from the last presidential election.
And here's what we heard from 2 Latino men in the battleground states of North Carolina and Pennsylvania.
Pues bueno, me afecta más que todo porque
it affects me because I'm Latino. You know how the relationship between Trump and Latinos is. That's him against. The pro is that he's already been president. He already knows how to run a country. It's fine, I agree. I'm not entirely against it.
We have to see how this man is going to come. If what he promises, which was the first thing he said in the early morning, the first thing he's going to do is fulfill his promises of government. And as a Latino, you feel a certain disdain, or what his colleagues in Puerto Rico said, and how he contemptuously speaks of Latinos. The last minute he wanted to look for them, but this has surprised me a lot.
All right, joining us now to talk about this further, former communications director for the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, Cristian Ramos, and national political reporter for the Washington Post, Sabrina Rodriguez. And Sabrina, we should look at where the shifts are because they are broad across the board. Cuban Americans in Miami-Dade, Puerto Ricans in Osceola County, Mexican Americans in the Rio Grande Valley. Trump made gains with all of them.
He did, and I think, after the 2020 election, we were having a similar conversation about Trump making inroads with Latino voters, but a lot of the narrative was then kind of written off to South Texas and saying, oh, it's just some of the Mexican Americans in South Texas. Oh, it's the Cuban Americans in Miami. Oh, maybe some Venezuelans in Miami. But This is undeniable. It is undeniable that a shift has happened, that a shift has happened toward Donald Trump, that he had a message that resonated with more Latino voters than even the polling showed us it would. And of course, I think there's always the added caveats that, exit polling will evolve in the days to come. We might see some shift in some of the numbers from these states, but the reality is that something did resonate, and that's a larger conversation to be having with the Democratic Party.
And it's a conversation that some of us have been having for years now, Christian, in part because you could see the trend sort of growing. You and I had discussions months ago talking about the messaging to Latino men, and you, to a degree, were questioning some of the stuff that was coming out of the Harris campaign.
This is what I think we have to have some deep soul searching within the Democratic Party, and it is with working class voters, period, writ large. And the thing that we have to figure out here is, how do we talk about the economy in a way that resonates with them? And what I mean by that is, Trump had no actual policies aimed at Latinos that would help make their lives better on the economy. He did have a cultural argument that was laced within the economy, which was very precise, saying to Latinos, Democrats care about this group more than they care about you. I will take care of you. Democrats, Kamala Harris actually had policies that would help Latinos, has helped Latino quite a bit over the last 4 years. They didn't feel that in the way that they did when Donald Trump was having these conversations in a way that was laced in cultural attacks. Democrats care more about immigrants, they care about this other group more than they care about you. I will take care of you. That has to be addressed with working class voters sooner rather than later if we're ever going to get back to where we were with Latino voters.
Okay, Christian, so how do they address that? Because sometimes in the past, I remember covering the Obama administration, and he said famously once, basically, we didn't talk about it the right way, or it was a messaging thing. And whenever you say that, people will say it's not just about how you talk about it, it might actually be the thing. But you really feel it's a messaging issue. So, is that what you're saying? It's how they're connecting with this voting bloc?
So, over the last 4 years, Democrats have created millions of jobs in the construction space, millions of jobs bringing manufacturing back, creating manufacturing hubs in places like Phoenix, right? Bringing Dell back to Phoenix. Again, creating jobs for these people. Latino men, they hear nothing about those things from Democrats. They don't hear about the work that they've done to help create construction jobs and to create more equity and opportunity for them. That's the opportunity going forward as we continue the conversations, because Republicans, again, have passed none of those laws. In fact, Donald Trump will make life much better for the mega wealthy, but for actual workers, none of that stuff will work.
Sabrina, there's a soundbite I want to play for you. This is from a DJ, Victor Martinez from Allentown, Pennsylvania. Let's listen to what he said.
It was a Latino man who decided that they were going to vote for Donald Trump. And I will dare to say that it's the Latino man who wouldn't want a woman president. And that is unfortunately, but that's part of the Latino culture, right? Where the Latino, the man is the one, the provider, and we're the boss. And we still unfortunately have a lot of Latinos with that mentality where the woman belongs in the kitchen. That is a reality of the Latino male chauvinist culture. And I think that's exactly what happened.
There are some data points that would contradict that, namely that a majority of Latinos voted for Hillary Clinton when she ran in 2016, I think like 66%. I'm just curious to get your reaction to that.
Look, Boris, I don't put sexism and racism past the United States. I think that for some people that was a factor. I've been out for months talking to Latino voters across the country, and some people did say that. Some people did mention outright to me, a Latina woman, that they would not vote for a woman, that they didn't want to see a woman in office, that they didn't think that she could be strong enough as a president. However, I think it would be short-sighted to just say that that is the reason why this happened. This is years of Donald Trump's messaging. Donald Trump's, campaign focused so heavily on targeting men, not just Latino men, but men across the board. We had conversations leading up to the election about black men, and we've seen so much his focus on, going on Joe Rogan's podcast and going to talk to young white men on college campuses. But with Latino men, there was this focus, like Christian was saying, about, the economy and how he's going to be better for you and how he's going to provide for your family and how things were so much better 4 years ago when he was president. And objectively, anyone that goes to the grocery store knows that things are more expensive. Anyone who's paying rent knows that it's more expensive. So for a lot of people, that was a compelling argument, even if it wasn't necessarily backed up with him, you know, outlining policies.
Sure. Christian, quickly, your reaction to that clip?
We have a lot of work to do to reach those voters. We've done a lot of incredible things to make that gentleman's lives better. Does he realize that there was Democrats that do that? Did we take that credit, have that conversation in a way that was culturally relevant to him? I don't know that we did. That's the opportunity coming ahead.
Christian, Sabrina, thank you so much to both of you. Really appreciate the conversation.
The Duchess of Hialeah.
That's
it
right.
Must be said.
We always have to get it in.
You have to fix this introduction.
We've got to put it in the Chiron, so let's get that fixed. Thank you, Duchess. Appreciate it. Still to come, why Ukraine's president says hugs with Putin won't help end the war with Russia amid fears of what Trump's second term will mean for Ukraine's future, and more voter reaction to Trump's election victory. Here's what one Harris supporter had to say.
It definitely kind of hit really hard that people would choose, you know, a campaign basically run on hateful rhetoric over somebody with a level head on their shoulders.
Where do we go from here?
What I can say is buckle up, because it's going to be a wild 4 years.
Some new international reaction to Trump's White House win. The Kremlin pushing back against Donald Trump's claims that he could quickly solve the conflict in Ukraine. They're calling those claims an over-exaggeration.
Meantime, a spokesperson for Iran's foreign ministry says the U.S. election provides opportunities to reconsider ill-suited approaches. And while we hear that from Tehran, Donald Trump's former Iran envoy tells CNN that he believes Trump will seek a policy to isolate Iran diplomatically and weaken it economically. We're following the international reaction with CNN's Nick Robertson in London and Fred Pleitgen in Berlin. Nick, let's start with you. You've been talking to sources within the Trump camp about this Iran strategy.
Yeah, and this is something that is not new within the sort of orbit of the Iran Mideast experts who give advice to President-elect Donald Trump. This is something that they've been thinking about for some time, and they would characterize it this way, that Donald Trump believes that he can achieve his foreign policy goals a lot through essentially what we might see as economic coercion. And in this case, in the case of Iran, is go back to maximum pressure, maximum sanctions, but this time make sure the sanctions really stick, prevent Iran from exporting oil as it does to China. These are the sort of some of the things that Iran could face. So I think when we hear from the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson saying that the elections provide an opportunity for the United States to change its sort of ill-suited agenda to Iran, it does seem that they're playing more to a domestic audience than the reality that they actually face. When President Trump gets into the White House, it's very likely that Iran is going to face a challenge, even if it had been Kamala Harris that had made it to the White House. Iran's actions in the Middle East with its proxies have caused enough international concern that this is a serious issue here in Europe for the Germans, the French and the British to want to get together with whoever is in the White House to figure out how to tackle Iran. And part of that agenda will be very much driven by how close Iran is getting to being able to produce a nuclear weapon. So this is going to be a big issue, and Iran knows that coming up. So I think what Iran faces is exactly as Brian Hook has laid out, those very strong economic sanctions that over time are really going to cripple it. And without intending regime change, there'll be many that hope that it will bring that.
And Fred, I do want to ask you how Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky is responding to the Trump win in the election, but I also just want to note that he has just said, confirmed, that North Korean soldiers have taken part in hostilities against the Ukrainian military, and he says that there are losses.
Yeah, he certainly did, and he said that all this is taking place in the Kursk region, which is, of course, where the Ukrainians conducted that incursion into Russian territory, and the Ukrainians for several days now have been saying that North Korean soldiers are present there. One of the interesting things, Brianna, that he also said today of Volodymyr Zelensky, this was at a conference in Hungary, is that he claimed that North Korea was essentially invading Europe, was waging war in Europe, and that if European countries and, of course, also the United States don't stand up to Russia, on whose side, of course, those North Koreans are fighting, that all of this will only intensify. So certainly there is a lot of concern on the part of the Ukrainians as to what this new administration can bring. One of the things that Volodymyr Zelensky also cautioned was not to play too nicely with the Russians. I want to listen to some of what he had to say today at that conference.
We need sufficient weapons, not support in talks. Hugs with Putin will not help. Some of leaders have been hugging him for 20 years, and things are only getting worse. He thinks only about wars and will not change. Only pressure can put limits on him.
So some pretty direct words there coming from the Ukrainian president. Of course, one of the things that President-elect Trump has said during the election campaign, and specifically after a meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, is that he wants to end the war as quickly as possible, and that he believes that his good relations, not just with Zelensky, but also with Russian President Vladimir Putin, will help do that. So he has praised his relations with Vladimir Putin. Well, Vladimir Putin has now essentially done the same thing. Just as we were going on air, I was actually on the sideline watching Vladimir Putin at an event in Sochi in southern Russia, and he, for the first time, congratulated Donald Trump on winning the U.S. presidential election. I just want to read that for you real quickly. He said, regardless of what he said about his desire to rebuild relations with Russia to facilitate and end the war in the Ukrainian crisis, I think this deserves attention at the very least, and I would like to take this opportunity to offer my congratulations to his election as President of the United States, guys.
All right, Fred Pleitgen and Nick Robertson, thank you to you both.
Still ahead, a destructive and rapidly growing wildfire in Southern California. Just the latest example of severe weather potentially fueled by the climate crisis as President-elect Trump returns to the White House with promises to pull out of international agreements on fighting climate change. We're following breaking news into CNN. The Federal Reserve cutting interest rates by a quarter point, marking the second cut of the year. It comes as Democrats grapple with this week's stunning election losses, with millions of voters citing the economy as their top concern. Let's discuss with pollster and communication strategist Frank Luntz. Frank, great to be with you as always. The Wednesday morning headline, voters hand Republicans a mandate. Do you think that this outcome was inevitable, given the truncated amount of time that Kamala Harris had to run a campaign, along with the economic headwinds, or was there more that she could have done in those 100-ish days to get elected?
There absolutely is more, and this is significant, because in the end, they're trying to undercut Trump's victory, which was significant. It wasn't a mandate, because it's still only a 3 or 4% victory, but it was significant. It was meaningful and measurable. First, she could have told people exactly what she wanted to do in the first hour, the first day, the first week, the first month. Second is that she could have explained much better why her positions have changed. The public doesn't like flip-flopping, but they do appreciate when you learn something, when you're not the same person now that you were 5, 10, or 20 years ago. And third, when she was positive, that whole first half of her campaign, right up to the debate, when she was joyful and energetic, enthusiastic in the crowds, and she talked about what she wanted to achieve, that was significant. And you saw it in the polling numbers, and you could feel the energy. But when she turned against Trump and attempted to redefine him, I heard the phrase from the campaign that they wanted to make sure no American had Trump amnesia. Well, guess what? We know everything there is to know about Donald Trump, good and bad. We know who he is, we know what he's about, we know where he stands. We did not know her. I think that when all is said and done, and the tears have been shed and the crying ends, that she will look at her campaign as a horribly missed opportunity to have a genuine conversation with the American people. That's why she lost.
Frank, what about the fact that Donald Trump, for the first time that he's run, is on track to win the popular vote? I mean, you just said that a lot of Americans that Americans know everything there is to know about Donald Trump. How is that the case, given that he's more popular than ever, and yet he uses rhetoric that is offensive?
For some people, what's offensive to other people, and I'm not a supporter of his rhetoric, but for some people, what's offensive for other people is telling it straight. And I do have a problem with the language that he used. I think it's not appropriate. I would like our president to be a role model in addition to a political and economic leader, and obviously the person who leads the army. I think that what a president says and what a president does absolutely matters, and that we should be trying to aspire to something greater. But that said, he was explicit. He focused on the things that mattered to him, particularly on immigration. And in the end, the public compared his immigration record and his proposals with Vice President Harris's record and her proposals, and they found Trump better than Harris. Make no mistake, if you asked a person who they liked better as a person, Vice President Harris won that comparison. But if you asked people who could better handle affordability, because it's really not the economy, it's about prices and costs, affordability and immigration, which is more about safety and security, they, by 10 points or more, gave that edge to Donald Trump. And once again, that's the reason why he won.
Frank, there's a lot of finger pointing within the Democratic Party. Moderates are blaming progressives. Progressives are blaming moderates. What do you think the path forward is for the Democratic Party?
So I'm eager to bring these focus groups, and you all have used them frequently, because we talk to these voter groups, and Vice President Harris did worse among men, particularly middle-aged men, particularly men who had voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016 and Joe Biden in 2020. And they felt like the Democratic Party had left them. This is no embrace, no bear hug of either Trump or the Republican Party. But they felt like Vice President Harris only cared about young women. And you saw it in the ads, you saw it in the rallies, you saw it in all the sound bites and the clips visually, that clearly she wanted to be a role model, and that's perfectly appropriate. And in fact, it's courageous to give young women a role model, but you don't do it at the expense of men who have been voting Democrat, working hard, playing by the rules, paying their taxes. And there are too many of these men who abandoned the Democrats in 2024. And frankly, they're going to have to focus on how you can still appeal to women, but not reject men, or they will not be the majority party again.
Frank Luntz, always appreciate your analysis. Thanks so much for joining us.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
There is a wildfire raging in Southern California, a late-season hurricane tearing through Cuba and threatening the U.S. Gulf Coast, and also record autumn heat across the country. These are now just some of the realities of climate change. The question is, how will the U.S. respond to it under a second Trump administration?
Yeah, there's a new report that finds 2024 is on track to be the warmest year ever. I know we're feeling that in Washington, D.C. today for sure, and it may cross a red line that scientists are really worried about. CNN chief climate correspondent Bill Weir is here with more on this. Bill, 2024 will be the first calendar year to exceed the Paris Agreement threshold. What does it mean for the planet?
Well, that line, that 1.5 degrees Celsius or 3 degrees Fahrenheit, was the idea that anything beyond that, it'd just be so hard to adapt and to do it in time. Once we hit 2%, if you think things are bad now, imagine the hell on Earth that would be 3 degrees of global warming. Well, Donald Trump is basically saying, go to hell, go to that hell, because he doesn't want to even acknowledge the existence of the problem. He won with a promise to supercharge the economy and fix the border and heal America. But climate change is the hole in every one of those buckets, making it that much harder to deal with streams of immigrants come from Central America after storms or droughts down there, dealing with the economy in places like Asheville, North Carolina, completely devastated. We'll put up a map of the ocean temperatures as well, hitting records around the globe, especially around the United States, the Atlantic and the Gulf there. That, of course, makes hurricanes stronger faster. It moves water cycles in much less predictable ways. It affects everything from insurance rates, there's a crisis on that, to supply chains. And the wildfire that you're talking about now in California. These warmer planet, it dries things out faster, makes a more flammable Earth. And so at the absolute time, science is saying that humanity must rally together, decarbonize as quick as humanely possible, and brace for the pain that's built in. The United States has elected really the most notorious climate denier in the public eye these days. Next week at COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan, the world is supposed to meet to talk about finance for developing countries, helping them adapt and get green in time. But we're already hearing diplomats may not be going because of the clues from the United States that Trump administration not interested in, certainly in global climate diplomacy. For the countries that really take this seriously, that's a major issue. But there may be enough built-in momentum with the clean energy projects, especially in Republican districts, Brianna and Boris, that it'll be hard to claw those back here in the United States.
All right, Bill Weir, thank you so much. It'll certainly be something to watch here. Ahead, as the country prepares for the return of Donald Trump to the White House, his transition team is looking at who he might want to put in his cabinet. So we'll talk to someone who could have a role and discuss the election results in depth after a quick break.
Let the finger pointing begin. Frustrations are boiling over within the Democratic Party over President Biden's decision not to step out of the race sooner. We have details on the blame game playing out behind the scenes. Meantime, President-elect Donald Trump is in full transition mode with allies maneuvering for positions in his administration. We'll tell you who may be topping the list.
And later, Rudy Giuliani returns to court after the two women he defamed accused him of hiding assets, including this, the Mercedes that he was just spotted in. We're going to tell you what the judge just told him. We're following these major developing stories and many more, all coming in right here to CNN News Central.
This hour, Democrats are doing some soul searching while Trump allies are doing searching for jobs. Today, as the Democratic Party tries to regroup and pick up the pieces following Donald Trump's decisive victory on Tuesday, we're learning new details on a growing wave of blame aimed directly at President Biden over his refusal to step aside sooner. Earlier today, Biden addressed the nation for the first time since Trump's historic win 2 days ago.
I also hope we can lay to rest the question about the integrity of the American electoral system. It is honest, it is fair, and it is transparent. And it can be trusted, win or lose. I will do my duty as president. I'll fulfill my oath, and I will honor the Constitution. On January 20th, we'll have a peaceful transfer of power here in America.
As President Biden promises a smooth transition, we're told the president-elect's allies are working frantically behind the scenes to secure jobs in his new administration, and that Trump is ready to reward those who stayed loyal to him. Kayla Tausche is live from the White House. Kristen Holmes live for us from West Palm Beach near Mar-a-Lago. And we have Mani Raju here with us in studio on where things stand on the balance of power on Capitol Hill. Kayla, we'll start with you. What's the White House saying about Democrats blaming Biden for this defeat?
Brianna, the White House is having none of it. Earlier today, saying that they're going to leave the postmortem to the pundits, and continuing to say that President Biden's decision to step aside in July and immediately endorse Vice President Kamala Harris was selfless. Here's the press secretary just a few moments ago.
President Biden believes that he made the right decision when he decided to step aside and immediately endorsed the vice president, and you saw the party come behind her, support her, and he believed it was the right thing for the American people. He put himself aside. This was not about him.
But the White House also alluding to a few reasons why the president felt empowered to remain in the race and run for re-election as he decided a couple years ago, citing first the results in the 2022 midterms, which had not been the red wave that many had expected, emboldening not only the president but also his inner circle, his top aides, that he could continue in the race, run again, and defeat Donald Trump again. And then there's also the fact that Biden aides continue to believe that he is the only person Republican that has and could beat Donald Trump. And even some that I've spoken to in recent days point to 2016, and they point to this election, and they say that remains true. All that to say, though, the party is doing some serious finger pointing, suggesting that had Biden announced that he was not seeking re-election, as roughly 80% of American voters suggested he should do back in 2023, that there would have been a robust primary process. Perhaps someone else, another rising star within the party, could have been picked and could have been a stronger candidate than Vice President Kamala Harris ended up being. All that to say, there's also an acknowledgement that hindsight is 20/20, and there's going to be a long road of evaluation of exactly what went wrong. But for now, the White House is saying it's not President Biden's fault.
Kayla Tausche, live for us from the White House. Thank you so much. Let's take you out to West Palm Beach now with CNN's Kristen Holmes. A lot going on there today, Kristen, as Trump and allies prepare to retake power. Take us behind the scenes at Mar-a-Lago as some of these allies try to jockey for position in this new administration.
Yeah, Boris and Brianna, the wheels are in motion. They are getting ready for a second Trump administration. Donald Trump has been on the phone nonstop. He met with his transition team yesterday. He's meeting with them again today. All of this trying to get ready for what exactly that administration would look like. Now, two things to keep in mind. There are two paths of what they are doing as part of the transition. One is they are working on the policy, drafting executive orders, talking about how quickly they can implement certain things. What do they actually need congressional approval for? What do they not need congressional approval for? Donald Trump himself has been talking not just to the transition team, but to a number of allies about what he wants to do first. He feels emboldened, I am told, by people who have spoken to him because of the fact that he won the popular vote, because of the fact that he won in different voting bloc coalitions, particularly among minority voters, indicating to him that he believes that his policies that he had been pushing forward on the campaign trails are ones that the American people want. Now, the other part of the transition is the personnel, as you mentioned. Who is going to go into what job? We are talking about thousands of jobs. Obviously, there are those top-tier jobs like chief of staff, the cabinet heads. We know Attorney General is one that he is taking extremely seriously, but there's also lower-level positions. How exactly do they want to go about that? One way we know is that they're likely to tap into Project 2025's personnel database, which was run by John McEntee. We're told that the personnel database will be sending over recommendations because they spent the last 2 years vetting people that they believe will be loyal to former President Donald Trump and now President-elect Donald Trump. And there are also people who are jockeying for those kind of positions behind the scenes. But I am told right now, it is really pounding the pavement for the Trump team. They are trying to make sure that the Trump transition team is in the right space, that they have the right people working on each of these different various things like justice, like immigration, like the economy, and that also they plan on going to Washington soon to meet with President Joe Biden, possibly as early as next week. So a lot of things are happening behind the scenes, but just one thing to note. We are looking at a completely different kind of transition and time period right now, and Donald Trump, than we saw last time in 2017. How that plays out obviously remains to be seen.
All right, Kristen Holmes, live for us from West Palm Beach. Thank you. And Manu Raju, Republicans have flipped the Senate. They have a really good chance of hanging on to the House. When are we going to know?
Yeah, actually, it may take a little time because a lot of these votes that are outstanding are in California. A lot of these are mail-in ballots. California historically has taken a bit longer. It took about a week or maybe a little bit over a week for the House to be called for the GOP back in 2022. Similar thing could happen here. For the Democrats to flip the House, things have to go really, really well with these outstanding races. Right now, trailing in races in California and some in Arizona. They would need to turn the tide on those races, get ultimately a net of 4 seats. And at the moment, they're not there yet. So the expectation that both sides have is that Republicans will maintain a narrow majority. But it's not over yet. They have to count the votes, and we'll see if something changes.
And in the Senate, Manu, we just talked about jockeying for positions in the Trump administration. In the Senate, folks are jockeying for the position of majority leader.
Yeah, and look, that's obviously a huge position, one of the most powerful positions in Washington. Sets the agenda, decides what bills can come to the floor, decides what nominations to pursue. Really instrumental to the party's strategy and messaging. Will be key to trying to hold the Republican majority in the next future election cycles. And the 3 candidates who are vying for it, Senator John Thune, the current number 2, Senator John Cornyn, who used to be the number 2, but was the top campaign committee chairman for 2 cycles, and Senator Rick Scott, a former chairman of the Senate GOP campaign committee, just won his second term on Tuesday. Thune and Cornyn are seen as the two leading candidates for this race that will happen next Wednesday. One of the big questions is, what does Donald Trump do? He has not made his preference known yet. And earlier today, John Thune himself was making the case why Trump should stay out of this race.
I'm staying in regular contact with him and with his team. And, you know, obviously, if he wants to, he could exert a considerable amount of influence on that. But honestly, I think my preference would be, and I think it's probably in his best interest, to stay out of that. These Senate secret ballot elections are probably best left to senators, and he's got to work with all of us when it's all said and done.
You know, it's unclear if Trump were to endorse how much of an impact it would have, because Thune is right. It is a secret ballot election. It'll happen next week. Members can vote however they want. But Thune and Trump had a bit of a fraught relationship for some time. Thune had criticized Trump, his efforts to overturn the election. Trump shot back, suggested he should get primaried. Thune has tried to bolster, trying to fix that relation, but perhaps that's one reason why he wants the president-elect to stay out of this race.
Yeah, really interesting. Manu Raju, thank you so much. And joining us now is Republican Senator Bill Hagerty from Tennessee. He was also ambassador to Japan in the first Trump administration. Sir, thank you so much for joining us today. Your name has been floated for a cabinet position. Are you interested?
Listen, Ron, I'll leave the speculation to the speculators. I'm just so excited that President Trump has delivered the mandate that he did on Election Day. I'm so pleased that Republicans are now in control of the Senate, and I do believe that we'll hold control of the House. So the opportunity before us is to literally turn our nation back on the right track again. You've got 72% of Americans saying that we're on the wrong track. This is a huge opportunity for America, and I look forward to working arm in arm with President Trump in whatever role to make certain that we get our nation, our great nation, back to the potential that we can.
Okay, but let's just say Secretary of State or U.S. Trade Rep. Do you have a preference?
As I said, I'm not going to engage in any speculation. I'll leave that to others. The main focus now is not to create sideshows, but to be getting ready to deliver for the American people. That's where I'm focused.
Okay, so I do want to ask you, though, about some pressing issues, because you are on the list of those being considered. Both President Biden and President-elect Trump publicly opposed the sale of U.S. steel to Japanese company Nippon Steel, which you were very aware of. You, of course, as I mentioned, were ambassador to Japan during Trump's first term. Do you think the sale of this company to a Japanese company is a national security risk?
Well, what I'd say first is this. My job as U.S. ambassador to Japan was to advance America's interest in Japan and throughout that entire region. That's the way I would look at any transaction here. It has nothing to do with the nationality of the company that's trying to make the acquisition, and it has everything to do with our national security, with American interests, with American jobs. That's the lens I think that we should apply. The national security lens is one that will be used, and there are issues, frankly, with this company from the past of unfair trade practices. We'll have to navigate through that, but it's certainly not anything that I'm advocating for or against based on the nationality of the country. It's based on America's primary interests.
So former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is an advisor to Nippon Steel in this deal, and Nippon Steel plans to invest a huge amount in steel production here in the U.S., which would create a lot of jobs in the U.S. And Pompeo has warned that if the deal falls through, it would mean the U.S. has to import more Chinese steel. China, of course, you're very aware of their trade practices. Yes. Is that true, his assessment, that you would have to import more Chinese steel if this deal doesn't go through?
Well, former Secretary Pompeo obviously is much closer to this if he's working alongside or helping Nippon Steel with this effort. I'll say this, if Nippon Steel hopes to prevail in this effort to make this acquisition successful in the United States, they're going to have to make their case in terms of the investments that they would make, the positive job implications it would have here in America, and the fact that it does support rather than detract from our national security. I'd have to see that case made, and I have not seen it yet.
And as you said, as ambassador to Japan, you were there to advance American interests, but do you worry
Certainly.
about alienating a key ally in Asia with China's rising power?
We have dealt with China's rising power for a great deal of time. Japan's interest and the United States' interest are completely aligned because both of our nations have suffered from the predatory practices of China, whether it's stealing our intellectual property, subsidizing industries to a level that makes it impossible to compete with them, and blocking our access to their markets. China does not play fair. They don't play by the same set of rules. You think about Japan's perspective, they're even more proximate to the threat of China. And if you look at what China has done in the East China Sea surrounding Japanese islands, the Senkaku Islands there. If you look at what they're doing in the South China Sea, frustrating trade routes, building artificial islands. Japan's interests are very much aligned with ours from an economic standpoint and a national security standpoint as we look at China. So I don't see any wedge being driven there at all.
CEOs of companies like AutoZone and Columbia Sportswear have already said that if and when President-elect Trump's broad tariff proposals go into effect, that they will simply raise prices and pass those costs on to consumers. Why pursue policies that would raise prices when it's clear from what the voters just said that the main issue they care about is how much things cost?
I'll put another question to you. Why take the word of these executives when what we've seen, these are pre-election threats, I presume. What we've seen in reality is when President Trump imposed the steel tariffs, the aluminum tariffs, everybody predicted there would be massive inflation. You know that President Trump left an economy to Biden and Harris that had only 1.5% inflation. It did not materialize. And I don't have any reason to expect that to occur again, despite whatever pre-election threats might have been delivered. I think what the networks need to think about is portraying the reality of President Trump's performance in the first administration. I served in that administration. He delivered a booming economy. Instead, the last 2 times I've interviewed on this network, talking about President Trump, I've had to defend claims of fascism, Hitlerism. It's amazing. The last time I was here, firing squad for Liz Cheney. I think it's time for the networks to really focus on what President Trump has done, rather than trying to perpetuate some sort of pre-election threats. Let's focus on what the results will be.
You, of course, are a senator. Who are you going to back in the election for majority leader next week?
Again, we haven't gotten to that point yet. That election will take place next week. We're going to hear from all of the candidates at that point. I'll tell you this. My #1 priority is making certain we have a leader that aligns our Senate with the incredible challenge that we've got in the next 100, 200 days of turning our nation back around, of working arm in arm with President Trump as he puts executive orders together, as we put a reconciliation package together, hopefully, to make certain that we advance those critical principles that the American public have voted us into office for. The mandate that we have is clear. We've got to turn our nation around so we see a stronger economy, stronger national security, a better posture, certainly at our border, deal with crime in our cities, and restore America's reputation around the world. It will take a majority leader that's going to work arm in arm with President Trump to get that to happen. Certainly, no one that's part of the resistance should be in a role like that. We've got to make this happen efficiently and rapidly. It's going to take that type of leadership to bring it all together.
All right, Senator, I heard you register a complaint there about what the media focuses on. I think this was a very substantial interview about the issues, however, and we appreciate you taking the time to talk about them. Thank you, Senator Hagerty.
Certainly. I look forward to talking again. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So now that the election is over, Trump's legal problems may soon be over as well. What we know about the 34 felony convictions he's supposed to be sentenced on less than 3 weeks from now. Also ahead, attorneys for Rudy Giuliani's defamation victims take him back to court, accusing him of emptying the apartment that he was supposed to hand over, including contents from it. CNN was inside the courtroom for the hearing.
And later, residents fleeing, schools closing, and tens of thousands are now without power as California battles a fast-moving wildfire being fueled by high winds. You're watching CNN News Central. We're back in just moments.
Donald Trump is now president-elect, but he's also a convicted felon who is awaiting sentencing. Trump's legal team is working to push off a court date set for just over 2 weeks from now, where he's scheduled to be sentenced in the New York hush money case.
He's also facing several other state and federal cases, so the open question is what happens to those now that he's been reelected? Joining us now to discuss is CNN Chief Legal Affairs Correspondent Paula Reed and CNN legal analyst and former federal prosecutor Elliot Williams. Paula, first, the New York hush money case. He was convicted of those counts. He's supposed to be sentenced in a few weeks. Does that just evaporate?
I think it will. The question is, how does it evaporate? Because I know, in speaking with a source familiar with his legal strategy, they're going to go to the judge and they're going to say, look, as a president-elect, he is entitled to the same protections as a sitting president. He is constitutionally protected, they will argue, from indictment, from prosecution, and they'll extend that to sentencing too. Now, separately, The judge had already, before Trump was reelected, given himself a deadline of next Tuesday to decide if that immunity case from the Supreme Court applies here and means the conviction should be tossed. If he thinks it is, well, the sentencing gets tossed too. But if that doesn't work, they're going to make this constitutional argument. There's also at least one appeal hanging out there, so they could also argue, hey, let's at least delay this. That's always been their request, right? Delay, delay, delay. This time, though, they're not asking for a delay. They're asking to nix the whole thing, and they will likely be successful, if not in getting it canceled, at least getting it delayed until he's in office, and then it's a moot point.
Okay, so those are the various options of legal evaporation. What do you think is most likely?
I think most likely is the judge either says, I'm not going to sentence you at all, or says, I will sentence you in 4 years, which is sort of impractical. But look, there's fantasy philosophical lawyer land, and there's the real world. In philosophical lawyer land, the judge can say, okay, look, I'm going to sentence you as I normally would in 60 days, which is how and when we sentence people. He's going to be either president of the United States or the president-elect then, and it's just not practical to impose a sentence at that point. Now, he can say, when you are a free citizen, your obligation is to come back here on January 1st, 2029, or January 21st, 2029, and come in for sentencing. Now, that's also kind of silly to push off the sentencing that far in advance. There just aren't a lot of great options here for the judge because of the reality we live in, where this person has a unique role in American government, and then the courts have to respect that in some way.
Paula, what about the federal cases being pursued by Special Counsel Jack Smith?
Well, I've learned from my sources that Smith is currently in conversations with top Justice Department leaders, including the Attorney General, about how to wind down those cases. It's a surprise to some people. They say, well, why don't they just at least work up until inauguration? Well, they know that internally there's a memo from the Office of Legal Counsel inside DOJ that says you can't indict, you can't prosecute a sitting president. They're working out how that applies to a president-elect, but they know these cases aren't going to trial, and I'm told that Smith wants to do what is correct according to Justice Department policy, but it's complicated. It's not just about dropping the case against Trump. He also has co-defendants. It's about the entire special counsel office. It's complicated in terms of the mechanics of winding this down. But everyone should remember, Smith is required to submit a report to the Attorney General. He is expected to make that public. I'm told not to expect a lot of news out of that, but as we've seen with all the other special counsels, or Rob Hur, Robert Mueller, Durham, once they submit their report, usually they receive a request or a subpoena to appear on Capitol Hill, and that could be some fireworks.
Yay, they get to be on TV, but not in a good way.
I don't think Jack Smith likes being on TV.
That they ever enjoy. No. Okay, so he also has a lot of co-defendants in this Georgia case. And I wonder what happens to them, but also as he has these abilities, once he is president on the federal cases, he doesn't on the Georgia case. So what happens for him there?
Oh, well, what happens for him there is some of the same things that Paul was talking about, which is that by being president, I don't think any court is going to find that a president can even sit for prosecution in a state case. Now, that I think affects Donald Trump as a defendant in Georgia. It's just not practical under the law, no matter how much people want it. Just this is what the law says right now. All those other defendants, none of them are subject to the same prohibitions as the President of the United States under the Constitution or existing law. And there's no reason that case, should it come back and be resurrected from its zombie form now.
But is there stuff that, because he's president, that now is off limits, that gets in the way of their cases?
This is where the litigation is going to come. Against him, it could be argued that he is evidence about him in the presidency can't come in against him, but who's to say that it couldn't come in against another defendant who's not a president of the United States? Now, it's a legal minefield, and it's got to end up in federal court at some point, but there's no reason that any of these people can't still be prosecuted.
You make such a good point, because people focus on the immunity decision about actions that you take, but it's really evidence. If you're trying to support a crime and you're trying to use acts that they took in their official capacity as evidence, it's going to be very difficult to prove that. So I think we've all really underestimated the extent to which the Supreme Court's immunity decision is perhaps going to embolden President-elect Trump and future leaders. It's really going to have an enormous impact on the guardrails that once existed. They're now gone.
It's a really interesting question. The case came down to him as president, but I think smart defendants in that case will say, wait a second, this also might apply to us given how our proximity to him, we worked in the White House and so on. So it's just a tricky minefield we're going to have to look at.
We'll see how it goes. Elliot, Paula, thank you both so much. Appreciate it. We have some breaking news into CNN. 5 projections to bring you now in House races. These are just into CNN. We are projecting that former Congressman Cleo Fields, a Democrat, will represent Louisiana 6. This is a seat drawn after a federal court mandated the state have another majority black district. This seat a pickup for Democrats. Meantime, in Nevada, Democrat Dina Titus has won re-election in Nevada's first House district. Titus is a fixture in Nevada politics, previously serving in the state Senate. Also, in Nevada's 4th district, Democrat Stephen Horsford has won re-election in the 4th district there. He's perhaps best known as the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus.
And Democratic Congressman Don Davis has won a second term in North Carolina. Davis is an Air Force veteran, was one of just 6 Democrats to vote for a resolution that condemned Vice President Harris's handling of the border. And Montana's 1st District will send Republican Ryan Zinke back to Washington. Zinke, of course, served as Interior Secretary during the first Trump administration. Now, we should note that none of these races is seen as an upset, but they do move us closer to finding out who will be in the majority in the House in the next Congress. So stay with CNN. We'll be right back with more.
Breaking news into CNN. Fed Chief Jerome Powell speaking to reporters and declaring the independence of the central bank as Donald Trump prepares to take office in January.
CNN's Matt Egan is joining us live now. Tell us what he said. It was brief, but it was key.
It was brief, Boris and Brianna. Look, the Fed takes its independence very seriously, and during a press conference just a few moments ago, the Fed chair was asked whether or not he would step down if he was asked by the president-elect to do so. Take a listen to that exchange.
Some of the president-elect's advisors have suggested that you should resign. If he asked you to leave, would you go?
No.
Can you follow up on, do you think that legally you're not required to leave?
No.
Now, Powell was also asked during this press conference whether or not the president can demote him or other leaders at the Fed, and he said that that is not permitted under the law. Now, look, some of this could be a little bit of a moot point because back in July, Trump already said that he would allow Powell to finish out his term. Earlier today, our colleague Kayla Tausche reported that, according to a Trump advisor, that Trump would be likely to let Powell serve out his term. Conservative economist Stephen Moore, he told me the same thing. He said that Trump would likely just kind of wait out the clock on Powell, whose term expires in May of 2026. But look, we know that the president-elect's mind can change, and it's easy to see a situation where he could decide that he wants to make a move on Powell. These two have had a very, very complicated relationship. Remember, it was Trump himself who tapped Powell to lead the Federal Reserve, but Trump has also been very critical of Powell. At times he said that Powell had the rates too high. Then he said they were too low. He questioned whether or not there was political motivations behind the interest rate cut back in September. I do think we need to watch the relationship between Powell and Trump very closely. They are two of the most powerful people in Washington, and there's a lot at stake here in terms of the economy and inflation. Boris and Brianna?
Sometimes a single word can just be so impactful as an answer, but it makes it tricky for the follow-up question, I will say. But no, he is not going to. All right, Matt Egan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
President-elect Trump, allies, and companies are already quietly making plans to deliver on one of his biggest campaign promises, which is the mass deportation of illegal immigrants.
CNN's Priscilla Alvarez is here in the studio with new reporting. Priscilla, what are you hearing from your sources?
Well, what I'm being told is that over the last several weeks and months, Trump allies and some in the private sector were quietly preparing to detain and deport migrants at a large scale. The reason the private sector has been talking about this is because the federal government leans on contractors to manage these detention spaces. In fact, there's only a very few number of facilities that are federally owned. So this had already been part of the discussion, and now they're telling me that they are expecting that to ramp up. Sources also telling CNN that the target at the beginning and these preliminary plans the team is putting together, the Trump team, is focusing on undocumented immigrants who have committed crimes. But another part of the discussion, too, is Dreamers, those undocumented immigrants who came to the U.S. as children. Now, some of them are protected under the Obama-era program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and they have typically had bipartisan support, but that could change. So we'll see how that conversation evolves over time. But I've been talking to officials about this, and they tell me, look, if he wants to do mass deportation, there are practical ways to make that happen. Of course, detention is going to be a key component of that because you'd have to arrest and then detain before repatriating. but it comes down to money. And in the past, the Department of Homeland Security has moved funds around to try to put money behind these detention spaces and these deportations. But this type of scale would require so much more than what the Department of Homeland Security can do with its limits, not to mention that repatriating people is also difficult, given that it requires us to have different diplomacy and agreements with these countries. But again, just to show you some of the numbers, because we're showing them here, it costs nearly $11,000 just to apprehend, detain, process, and remove one undocumented immigrant. So if you do this at a large scale, you're starting to look at a really big price tag. So certainly in all the conversations I've had, the preparations are ongoing, and there are steps that are being taken, especially within the private sector, knowing that this could certainly happen, but it is not an easy feat.
And to that point, Donald Trump just moments ago was speaking to reporters off camera, and apparently he reiterated his plan to carry out mass deportations. When he asked about how much an operation of that magnitude would cost, he said it's not a question of a price tag. Quote, "It's not really. We have no choice when people have killed and murdered, when drug lords have destroyed countries, and now they're going to go back to those countries because they're not staying here. There is no price tag." I wonder, Priscilla, what are the conversations like now for officials at the Department of Homeland Security and other places, other federal agencies that may have to follow this directive from the president?
Well, in some cases, well, let's start first with there is a price tag. There is money that needs to be put behind an effort like this. The Department of Homeland Security officials are no stranger to the whiplash with immigration policy. You had the Trump administration, the first term, then President Joe Biden came in and reversed those policies, and now they're already signaling that they're going to reverse what the Biden administration did and put in the Trump administration policies all over again. So there's a mixed bag of emotions. Some people tell me that it's been shell shock, especially among the political appointees. Others tell me that there's optimism and hope because they want a stronger position and posture on the U.S. southern border. So it's certainly a mixed bag, but this is where we have come in terms of immigration policy, which is it's a patchwork system, and it's whoever is in office that's going to dictate what the policy is, because there hasn't been any change to immigration law, which would offer a permanent change. So in talking to multiple Homeland Security officials over the last 24 hours, they say, we're ready. If we will do what needs to be done according to what the incoming president says, but this is not a way to run a system.
Priscilla Alvarez, thank you so much for the reporting. We want to expand the conversation now. Joining us live is Democratic Congressman Joaquin Castro of Texas. Congressman, thank you so much for being with us, and congratulations on your reelection. I do want to ask you about the potential for mass deportations and the Trump comments about there not being a price tag. But first, I want to get your thoughts on Tuesday and what we saw unfold with the election. Broadly, what do you think should be Democrats' biggest takeaway?
Well, look, it was a tough night for Democrats, but it's true that we've also had tougher nights over the years. The Democratic Party, as you can imagine right now, is in a period of self-reflection and trying to figure out why we lost and what we need to do next time to make sure that we win. That's what political parties do after suffering losses in elections. And I think that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden did an incredible job for 4 years in helping our economy bounce back from a once-in-a-century pandemic. We had record job growth. We had record low unemployment. But I also think that a lot of families, including a lot of Latino families, were still feeling a hit from inflation, much of it that was driven by corporate profiteering and price gouging. And unfortunately, as Democrats, we were reluctant to point the finger there. And so in the election, part of what happened is that Donald Trump and the Republicans, they ran a campaign that was based on fear and resentment, that was pointing the finger at immigrants, at migrants. They wanted every American to believe that everybody who was seeking asylum to this country was a potential serial killer. They were pointing the finger at trans kids. I think they spent over $200 million in ads on the trans issue. And so they found an enemy and zeroed in on that and worked as hard as they could to convince Americans that these folks were the problem and they were the reason that folks were feeling hardship in their lives. And so, we got to go back and make sure that we stand up for people, that we stand up for people's constitutional rights, especially because of what you just talked about with mass deportation and other issues. And so we're in the process of that evaluation now. Given your view of that self-reflection among Democrats and
and the view of Republicans having scapegoated migrants. I'm curious to get your thoughts on Latino voters, especially in the Rio Grande Valley, because Trump had a near sweep of border counties there. What did Trump do right, and how much do you attribute his success to his stance on immigration?
Well, again, I mean, I think that they zeroed in on scare tactics and trying to convince all Americans, including Latinos, that, hey, these people are not like you. These people are coming to hurt you, to harm you. They made up these conspiracy theories about Haitian immigrants in Ohio, about Venezuelans all over the country who were taking over a lot of different apartment complexes and so forth. And so the media environment is also not what it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. You have a lot more misinformation and disinformation that is being pumped out and often sold and sometimes accepted as truth. And that's very powerful, and it moves people. And I don't think as a country or even as a political party that we've reckoned with how powerful that can be. But like I said at the beginning, there is an economic element to it as well. I do think that grocery prices, for example, went up too high, too fast, and people were feeling it. And when people are feeling it in their lives like that, they're looking around for a reason. Why is this going on? And unfortunately, I think oftentimes Donald Trump and the Republican Party sold them a scapegoat or scapegoats in this election.
There were undoubtedly frustrations among many Latinos, especially in border communities, with Biden's immigration policy. I do wonder, when you hear some folks accuse Latino voters that supported Trump of misogyny and racism, how that sits with you, because there's evidence that points to the contrary. I do wonder how much you think those factors played a role.
Well, first, I don't think that it's fair to blame Latino voters for Donald Trump's win. If you look at a state like Pennsylvania, the percentage of Latino voters is relatively small. And I have heard some of the claims that you've talked about, but I would ask people to remember that our Latino community, this is a community that overwhelmingly supported the first black president of the United States in that election in 2012, that overwhelmingly supported Hillary Clinton to become the first woman president of the United States. So it's a community that is in solidarity with working class people, with people that have experienced injustice, with aspiring people in this country who are reaching to achieve their American dreams. And I don't think Democrats, it would be a mistake not only to lay that blame now, but also to give up on the community. I think that would be a big mistake by the Democratic Party.
What do you think Vice President Harris could have done differently?
Oh, I mean, to be honest with you, Boris, I think that's going to take some more time, at least from me. It's been a few days from the election. She poured her heart and soul into all of it. She and Tim Walz, so many of the surrogates that went out there, the Legion of Volunteers and everything. And I know it's your job to look for answers and try to get answers and everything. But at least for me, it's going to take a little bit while longer to figure out on our end what we could have done differently. I mentioned one thing I really think that we should have been honest about what was going on with price increases, for example. That's one for sure. There are other things as well, but I promise that when we talk again, I'll have a fuller answer for you.
I look forward to that conversation. Congressman Joaquin Castro of Texas, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Stay with News Central. We'll be right back.
Former Trump attorney Rudy Giuliani has until next Friday to hand over his assets or face contempt. Giuliani was back in court today after he missed a deadline to surrender items to the 2 Georgia election workers that he defamed.
Those workers say they're still waiting to collect some of his most valuable possessions, including this Mercedes he was spotted cruising in on Election Day with a top back and microphones in his face. CNN's Caitlin Polantz is live outside the courthouse in Manhattan. Giuliani got a bit of a scolding in court today, and then he had microphones in his face again as he was leaving. Walk us through what happened.
Yeah, the judge said the keys to that car, the title of that car, enough is enough. Giuliani has to follow the court's orders and has to turn those things, as well as a number of other luxury items, expensive things, watches he has, sports memorabilia, things he's put into storage in Long Island. All of that has to get to the lawyers of Ruby Freeman and Shaye Moss by the end of next week. They're going to give him a time and a place by Monday on where he needs to deliver all of those items to get them to them, because he's so in debt to these two women. And Judge Louis Lyman here at the federal court in Manhattan is trying to enforce that winning, those judgments that they have received there. But just to give you guys an idea of how difficult this is for Ruby Freeman and Shaye Moss, there was a moment in court where Judge Lyman was discussing with Giuliani himself, who was here, about a sworn statement he made that said he was the only person who knew where his assets were. And Giuliani stood up in the middle of court and tried to tell the judge he didn't even want his own name on that statement, saying he knew where all of the things he owns would be. And the judge said, that's farcical, and you don't have a right to exercise self-help. You can't just decline to answer questions because you disagree with them. So that's how the hearing played out over more than an hour. After court, Giuliani did get the judge's orders quite firmly, but he came outside and he had more to say. When asked by CNN if Donald Trump might be helping him now that Trump is returning to the presidency and Giuliani's been out there supporting him publicly, here's what he had to say.
Do you think Mr. Trump can help get you out of this? Mr. Trump doesn't have to help me get out of it. All Mr. Trump has to do is straighten out the legal system. And you'll find out who the real criminals are. I mean, the bringing of this case was a complete abuse of process. The $145 million judgment to anyone sensible is ridiculous, obviously punitive, obviously done because I'm a Republican and I was in a Democratic dictatorship, which, by the way, New York is.
So the deadline is firm from the court. Ruby Freeman and Shaye Moss can go for Giuliani to get these things from him. They also can go to the Trump campaign to try and collect $2 million that Rudy Giuliani says he was never paid from the 2020 election. Back to you.
Interesting. Caitlin Polantz, thank you for that. And ahead, vaccines could face new scrutiny under the Trump administration. We'll have that next.
Breaking news into CNN, sources tell us that the FBI has informed one of President-elect Donald Trump's lead attorneys that his cell phone was tapped by Chinese hackers.
CNN's Paula Reed is part of the team that broke this reporting. Tell us what you're learning here, Paula.
So we've learned that Todd Blanche, one of President-elect Donald Trump's lead criminal defense attorneys, his phone was tapped by Chinese hackers. This is part of a wide-ranging operation targeting top Republican and Democratic political figures in the U.S. Now, a source familiar with the intrusion says that Blanche was informed last week by the FBI that hackers were able to obtain some voice recordings and also some text messages from his phone. Now, the source says that this information has no connection to the president-elect. There's no indication that anything that was taken from Blanche's phone is related to the president-elect, but they were able to obtain some information, including communications with family. Now, Blanche is the second of Trump's attorneys who have been confirmed to have been hacked by foreign adversaries back in August. CNN reported that another one of Trump's attorneys, Lindsay Halligan, was also hacked by Iranian efforts. So this is significant because, again, you think about what Todd Blanche may be doing in the upcoming administration. He's someone whose name has been floated for jobs like White House counsel or even a top position in the Justice Department, and the kind of information on his phone would certainly be of interest to foreign adversaries.
Paula Reed, thank you so much for that update, a story we will continue tracking. Donald Trump could start naming some of his key White House staff any day now, and there are questions about whether vaccine skeptic and conspiracy theorist RFK Jr. will be in charge of health policy.
CNN medical correspondent Meg Terrell is here to explain how the U.S. currently tracks vaccine efficacy and safety. Meg?
Hey guys, so RFK Jr. has talked about not taking anybody's vaccines away, but saying he'll immediately begin studying vaccine safety and efficacy. And this has public health experts kind of scratching their heads. They're sort of wondering what isn't out there that he thinks he's going to examine and reveal something new, because the system for reviewing vaccines both before they're on the market and afterwards is incredibly robust. Before a vaccine gets to market, it starts out with animal studies before it can get to human clinical trials. Often those take years, thousands of participants. Then it gets That's the FDA review process where documents are posted publicly, both from the manufacturers and from the FDA in its own review. Reviewers often make a recommendation to the FDA. The FDA decides whether to approve something. Then after it gets on the market, CDC's group of outside advisors meets to review and discuss whether a vaccine should be added to the schedule, who should get it, how frequently. The CDC's director then can decide whether to accept that recommendation. And even years after vaccines are out on the market, there are multiple ways in place, both from the CDC and the FDA, that they're continually monitoring vaccine safety and efficacy. But what is really worrying public health officials and experts that I've talked with is the idea that RFK Jr. could shake confidence in vaccines through this kind of language. And we are already seeing rates of things like the MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, and rubella, declining to levels below where the CDC says they need to be to achieve herd immunity and protect everybody in a community. They haven't been above 95% for kindergartners for the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine since 2019-2020. So that is really concerning to folks who are worried about diseases like measles, or for other vaccines, things like polio, potentially coming back. Guys?
Meg Terrell, thank you so much. A real-life game of Jumanji is playing out in one small South Carolina town after 43 monkeys escaped from a research facility. This is what the primates look like. They're still on the loose after escaping from the Alpha Genesis Primate Research Center.
Police say the research center had eyes on the monkeys and were attempting to entice them with food. Sounds like it should work, right? A town administrator reportedly told the media, "We're not talking about Caesar, a Planet of the Apes, but if you spot any primates, don't approach or try to interact with them or feed them, call 911. The monkeys are all female and between 6 to 7 pounds. They have never been used for testing, and they are too young to carry disease.
They're adorable. They're probably not a danger. What do you think they're trying to entice them with as far as food? Banana's the easy answer.
Bananas, yeah.
But I don't know.
Any kind of fruit, I would think.
Yeah.
Maybe
Popeye's
some
chicken sandwich. Spicy chicken
that
sandwich.
is always a good bet, right?
It's going to be my afternoon meal. I'm sad that we didn't talk about Raygun, friend of the show, parasocial friend of the show. I don't know if she knows that we
Be
exist.
attracting the monkeys with some breaking.
The Australian breakdancer is retiring from breakdancing. We didn't talk about it today. What a travesty. The Lead with Jake Tapper starts right now.